Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. And comment where are you watching from and the time or watching this video. Ever wondered what happens when darkness falls and the rain starts? Stay with us to find out in tonight's chilling story. Let the gentle rain and these chilling tales carry you off to sleep. Sweet dream. I bought a haunted painting to see if anything would happen. You actually bought it, didn't you? The daggered sting of my girlfriend's eyes pierced my back as I fumbled the package inside and into the foyer. My dog Max continued barking from the recent sound of the doorbell. Easy, bud. I reassured him with a pet and grunted with the effort of stretching my arms to carry the wide package by myself into the hallway. Yeah, I bought it. The last one you showed me, that's super creepy? That one? The one and the same. Why? After scooting the painting near the intended wall space, I turned to face her. Cams, come on. I told you this already. Possibly haunted. She crossed her arms with a defiant stare, which I mimicked with an eyebrow raise. I hate it when you call me that. I'd even take Camilla over Cams. Okay, Cammy, sheesh. Max barked once again. Hey, easy. You don't even care that I hate it, do you? Does that mean nothing to you? Look, you're creeped out by it, and that's fine. That's what makes it so interesting. It's supposed to be creepy. It's a haunted painting. I pulled the painting out of the box, but the awkward size caused me to almost drop it. To my surprise, Cammy helped me. Really? I thought you hated it. Let's just see it hung up. Get this over with. We removed the painting and cut off the layer of protective paper between the box and painting. After holding it up to the wall, I beamed. Gonna be a good fit, don't you think? I still hate it. The scene was surreal, depicting warped, destitute people crawling away from something unknown. A child was featured with tears streaming down his face. There was an obvious undertone of red, as if a thin undercoat had been applied. It was just as foreboding as it was enigmatic. Look, it's fine. They listed it as a haunted painting to make it sell better. Do you really think it's haunted? I do know, but I hope so. You're so stupid and weird. That's sort of why I like you. She punctuated this with a kiss. With her help, we managed to get the strange painting up in the hallway, and I'm not gonna lie, it looked even better than I anticipated. I flung my arm around her neck, and Cammy leaned into me. Perhaps all was forgiven. Let's step away from our haunted painting for a moment and get some lunch. On our way to the kitchen, we jumped at the sound of something striking the side of our house. I ran outside to find a bird had flown hard into the brick exterior and broke its neck. Cammy gave me a hard stare. See? Things are getting interesting already. I hate it already. I smiled and tried my best to hide it, but deep down I knew this may be more than I bargained for. That night, we were heading to bed, and I noticed the absence of our loyal companion. Max? About to turn into the bedroom, I heard my dog's nails click back and forth in the hallway behind me, but he didn't approach. I flicked the hallway light back on, and Max kept eye contact while pacing to the left and right. Seemed like he wanted to move forward, but couldn't compel himself to. Hey, what's wrong, buddy? I walked towards him and knelt down to give him a chest rub. He looked back and forth from me to the hallway, his eyes pleading for understanding. What is it? What's bothering you, huh? His gaze stopped long enough for me to locate the source of his stress. I got chills for a second. His eyes were locked onto the painting. Yeah, there's scary faces on it, I know. This was meant more for my own comfort than his, but I would have never admitted it. My girlfriend stuck her head in the hallway and watched on. Okay, bud, come on. Can't leave you out here. I gave him a little nudge toward our bedroom, but he didn't move. Come on, work with me here. I grabbed his collar and pulled him towards me, but he wouldn't budge. He even yanked his head back and slipped his collar. All the while, he never took his eyes off that painting. You're shitting me. The panting, isn't it? Oh, I'm off it. Dogs are really good at recognizing human expression, which is one of the reasons they know when something's wrong with us. He sees those distorted faces, and it bothers him. Yeah, maybe, but never seen him act like that. Ever. I hated to admit, but she had a good point. After a couple more attempts, I gave up as Max had made his choice known. poor guy was completely terrified of the thing. It may have just been my imagination, but I thought I felt a cold chill when I passed the painting on my way to the bedroom. I do not like that thing. I heard you the first time, sheesh. Yeah, it's kinda weird. It was a weird day. Don't worry about it. Max will get used to it. Before going into the bedroom, I shot Max one last glance. Last call. As if he completely understood, he laid down with his head between his paws and let out a defiant grunt. Okay, fine. I'll leave the door open if you change your mind. Without incident, we settled for bed, and apparently I was more tired than I realized. I'm usually a night owl, but I very quickly fell asleep. A sound jolted me awake, and in my stupid state I swore a bark had woken me up. Max? The sound of paws clicking against hardwood resounded in the dark, and I almost jumped at the cold muzzle brushing my hand. It was something I never got used to, no matter how many times he did it. But this was how he told us he needed to go out. Okay, boy, give me a sec. I patted the floor for my sandals with my feet and slipped them on. This was one of those mindless routines you do a million times on autopilot. Our house was in a quiet neighborhood, so the only sounds were my sandals flopping on the wood floor and Max's panting. When I reached the thermostat in the foyer, I rubbed my arms while I checked it. Geez, it's freezing in here, and it's July. The thought of the haunted painting came to mind, and I was somehow excited at the thought despite how terrifying that could be. What the hell was wrong with me? I was a glutton for punishment. After closing the thermostat's cover, I started to turn back towards the front door when I heard a growl. Max? I flicked on the foyer light to find him cowering at the front door with his haunches up. Hey, it's just me. Come on, let's go. Before the words left my mouth, it suddenly dawned on me that it didn't make sense for Max to be at the front door. I could feel his hairs brushed up against my leg as I was looking at him 6 feet in front of me. He'd never left my side the whole time I walked to the foyer. Max bared his teeth and growled towards me, looking more ferocious than I'd ever seen him before. What the hell was beside me? I didn't want to look, but I knew I had to. The hairs stood up on my neck as I slowly turned and looked down at a pitch-black canine figure with deep red eyes boring into me. What the? I leapt toward Max with the intention of rushing him outside, but when I looked back to shut the door, the thing was gone. My heart was beating so fast I had to lean against the wall to catch my breath. My companion licked my hand and whimpered, I know, buddy, I know. Let's go out. We came back inside, and the unnatural cold in the house had subsided, along with the eeriness that saturated the air. This painting must be the real deal. But what was I to do now? Could I really get rid of it when it was possibly the most interesting thing I'd ever had? Only time would tell. The next day went surprisingly well with no incident, and it turns out that my girlfriend slept through the whole ordeal with Max at the door. I thought it best not to tell her. No point in feeding her fears right now. As we were eating dinner that night, I went to get us some snacks for our movie we picked out. Sadly, we were all out. It's not movie night without snacks, she insisted. Yeah, I guess you're right. I can go grab some real quick. Want to come with? Nah, I think I'll stay here. I'm really tired for some reason. Please make it quick, though. Her eyes darted back toward the hallway, and I instantly felt guilty. Maybe this painting wasn't worth it if it made her feel this way. But then again, $150 was a lot for me, and I really liked it. I swear sometimes I don't deserve her. I grabbed a small pack of popcorn bags from a local corner store and made my way back in about 10 minutes, not a little more. As I turned the key to enter, I instantly felt a wash of dread come over me. Something was off. Babe? I called out as I entered the foyer. No response. I stood in the space between our bedroom hallway and our kitchen, noticing that the bathroom at the end of the hall was closed with a light on. She was just in the bathroom and didn't hear me. That was why it was such a shock when my girlfriend appeared from the den and stood cold in her tracks. You? Just got back? Like just now? Yes. Obviously you're not in the bathroom. You left the light on. Tears started welling up in her eyes, and she cautiously stepped closer to me. Please tell me you're joking. I'm not. What's going on? I didn't go into the bathroom. You did. Really? You want to scare me back because you don't like... Listen to me. You came in just a couple minutes ago and said you had to use the bathroom. Babe, that's impossible. My eyes stayed locked on the bathroom door the entire time, and I witnessed a shadow under the door frame moved from behind the door. Get Max. Run to the car and call. Our bathroom door blew open, banging against the wall with such a force it left a dent. We expected to see something foul and hideous awaiting. We were greeted by nothing at all. Our eyes met, both wide in fear as we looked back to the bathroom in a vacuum of sound. The bathroom light suddenly flicked off on its own, and footsteps pounded toward us so hard it shook the floor. A disembodied scream from nowhere screeched, and Max started losing his mind. Just as the heavy footsteps closed the distance, and I thought this invisible force was going to plow into me, footfalls stopped. There was a silence, and Cammy burst into tears. She wasn't ready for this, and I wasn't prepared for this. Biting my lip, I ran over to the painting with the intention of taking it off the wall, but I couldn't get a purchase on it. I yelped in pain and rushed to the kitchen sink, running cold water over my hand. Cammy saw that my hands were blistered from an intense heat, as if I'd touched a hot iron skillet. "What the hell is going on here?" she said through sobs. "You already know. That thing's not just haunted, it's cursed. Gotta be. It won't let you throw it out, maybe it's protecting itself." As I bought it, we reflected on the situation for a moment, and I decided to message the seller to see if they'd give me a refund. They responded immediately. "No, I'm not taking that thing back." "So you knew it was really haunted?" "I straight up told you it was. It's done enough to me. It's your now. How do I make it stop?" "You have to sell it to someone else." "I can't do that, not in good conscience." "Then you have to live with it. When you buy this painting, you don't own it. It owns you. I've had my 1 month of hell, and that was more than enough." I relayed the conversation to Cammy. "What are we gonna do now?" I relented. Suddenly her eyes went bright in epiphany. "So you own it, or it owns you, right?" "Yeah, that's what I just said." "But we don't." An understanding passed between us, and she smiled wide, an angry determination in her. She yanked the horrid painting off the wall and stomped it to fragmented wood frame pieces and shredded paper. We bagged it up and tossed into the trash can outside. Trash is tomorrow, so it'll be gone before you know it. I hope so. I really, really hope so. The next day, I got ready and rushed off to work, very satisfied to hear the beep of the garbage truck, not far from our street. I worked until 12 and started my break. Halfway through, I was surprised not to hear from Cammy. Alarm bells started going off in my head, knowing everything that happened until now. I rushed home and found her car still there, calling her phone and getting no answer. I explained to my work that there was an emergency situation, which they gave me no issue on. The police were a bit trickier, as it wasn't long since I saw her, and they wouldn't even consider doing anything until she hadn't shown up that night. By then, I'd called everyone she knew. Cammy was nowhere to be found. That night, I couldn't rest at all from crying and feeling this overwhelming weight of despair that told me Cammy wasn't okay. By noon the next day, my fears were confirmed. Police showed up to my house to tell me in person. They got a call from City Waste Management. Cammy was found crushed to death in the garbage truck's compactor. There was no evidence to show how or when she got in there, just the mangled remains of what used to be my girlfriend's body. My mind didn't accept the news completely. It was too awful to bear. I blankly stared back at the officers and thanked them for what I'm not sure. I shuffled back into my home and collapsed on the couch, Max giving me what comfort he could. At some point, something stirred me from my sleep. There were no words for it, just the feeling of something pulling me. Time skipped, and I found myself in the hallway staring at what used to be a blank space on my wall. It was back, untouched and in perfect condition, but with one final touch. The thought of it was nothing short of horrific. Somehow it was comforting at the same time. Everything was going to be okay. I just had to look on the bright side. I could visit Cammy anytime I wanted now, and all I had to do was look at my painting to see her. Her muffled screams from inside the painting were the only sound she made. Still, it made me feel better, despite it all. As the shadows grow longer, another tale of terror unfolds. Her unusual request seemed innocent enough. Now I'm living with the consequence. All right, I cannot believe I am stooping to this level. Quite frankly, there isn't much else to do. I could ruminate over my inauspicious circumstances, wallow in self-pity, and listen for any indication of life above my head. See how far I can spit. Perhaps with some practice, I'd reach the rat droppings. At least I think they're rat droppings, at the other end of the room. But then again, I'd require head momentum, which is in limited supply these days. Defecate and assess whether rashes truly form quicker on chafed skin. Over the past 4 days, I'd already done all of those things. Multiple times. Well, except for that last one. Shitting myself once proved to be plenty. I'd hoped it'd provide a pretense to see more of the house, but Mrs. Ingram took one whiff and said she'd let me stew in it, teach me a lesson. And teach me a lesson it had. After sitting in my own dung for a couple of days, I was much obliged to relieve myself into the bucket she brought by twice a day. Once after breakfast and once after dinner. Coached, her expression indecipherable. Though she had done this a million times prior, your bladder will adapt with time. An objection bubbled up in my throat, but Mrs. Ingram wagged her index finger like I was a snot-nosed kindergartner gnawing on a piece of Jenga. 5 more days, her eyes flickered. Like we agreed. 5 days. Even Aaron Ralston lasted longer than that in 127 hours. Although, of course, he wasn't getting hash browns served to him at breakfast. Granted, at this point, I'd been here for 5 days already, and as for my alleged consent, well, I took her word for it. The contextual clues were sparse enough as it was. The flashy New Year's party I'd attended with the other writers from the magazine was the last thing I remembered. Janine had gotten piss-drunk and passed out in one of the bathroom stalls. Even the Armani floor tiles couldn't save her teeth. I spent the first 2 hours of 2022 camped out on a bench near the hospital entrance with a makeshift flask, a packet of smokes for company, when my sight was obscured by a black duffel. I suppose I could have simply passed out from the booze. 3 jacks, 7 tequila shots, and some obscure German lager certainly made that a feasible possibility. All the same, though, the suffocating wool against my skin, the flutter of stomach acid, subtle scent of chloroform, or was it the cherry vodka in my flask? My body was already neatly strapped in when I awoke. Secured to what felt like an adjustable examination table, my back pinned straight, with only minor leeway for movement. In retrospect, it wasn't all too uncomfortable. Or at least, I could appreciate how it could have been much worse. My ankles appeared to be clamped down. My hands were mostly free to roam. Not that there was much point in plowing the air. Still, I thrashed about like the big man I was, until the sentiment sunk in and I settled down enough to examine my surroundings. The room was dimly lit, but bright enough for me to make out its fissured ceiling and coarse, discolored walls. Wooden racks towered against them, laden with books, boxes, and plastic rubbish bag. I could not see a door, but a narrow ascending staircase suggested that it was simply out of my line of sight. All in all, the room resembled a run-of-the-mill cellar. "Hello?" I called out, the back of my throat plastered with cigarette tar. Well, the health warnings on the packs had certainly delivered. "Hello, anyone there?" Footsteps feathered the top of the stairs and began their gradual descent. I held my breath. If there was a door at the top of the stairs, it had never opened. Whoever the footsteps belonged to had been hiding out in the darkness and listening, waiting. "Oliver?" Her voice was surprisingly demure, dwindling my expectation of a callous executioner into obscurity. Perhaps this was a contemporary remake of the Hostel series. Inclusivity is popular nowadays. Surely, this woman was just as capable of cutting my face off as the guy in the movie. Better, even. With cleaner cuts, I'd read somewhere that women have steadier hands. Although I couldn't actually see her. Whoever she was, she remained shrouded by darkness. Oliver Cohen? I gawked as she moved close enough for the amber ceiling light to touch her face. She wasn't nearly as delicate as her voice had made her seem. Standing at about 5'9", she was stout and in her early 50s. Her graying hair was pulled into a tight bun, and the short-sleeved blouse she wore under her white apron showcased a pair of well-built arms. "Oliver," she repeated, sudden curtness in her tone indicating her capacity for pleasantries was running out. "Why, yes," I smacked my dry lips. "Oliver." She took a step closer, and I recoiled about 2 inches, which was just about as far as my confines would allow. A waft of body odor emanated from beneath the collar of my shirt. Wait, don't. Where am I? Concern shrouded her expression, and I couldn't help thinking how in any other context, this woman would have surely been the protagonist. It's all right, son. She held out her outstretched palms, an overt demonstration of benevolence. It's only a temporary arrangement. Where am I? I demanded, doing my best to keep my tone from wavering. She exhaled slowly as she considered my question. You're in the Ingram home, she said eventually. Our guest. A patch of goose flesh cropped up beneath my shirt as I mulled over the very real possibility the woman in front of me was clinically insane. Did she, or they, make it a habit to chain their guests in the cellar? If so, I needed to change my tactics, and fast. Mrs. Ingram, I spoke with the cadence of a seasoned reporter, praying she wouldn't pick up on the quiver in my voice. Can you tell me what happened? I felt like a fool and sounded even worse, but Mrs. Ingram didn't bat an eye. You showed up at Hopley Hospital late last night with your friend, she stated just as matter-of-factly. The girl with missing teeth. Deneen, I muttered under my breath. She'd be wondering where in God's name I'd disappeared to. While you were in the waiting area, my colleague Anita asked if she could put you down for a social experiment conducted by our neurology department. She paused as if to give me a chance to object, but I knew better than that. We were thrilled when you agreed to partake. A decade of journalism experience couldn't distill the stunned silence that ensued. She was lying to me, deceiving me right to my face. Sure, I'd been inebriated, but not to the degree I'd do something that extends so far beyond my comfort zone, and not nearly enough to forget the chloroform duffel over my face. But wait, did she say neurology department? Could she be lying to me on purpose? Was this a part of the experiment? Was that even legal? I thought back to the Milgram experiment I'd researched a couple of months prior. Was all this but a cleverly designed simulation? And this experiment, my chest felt tighter now, and the odor under my shirt considerably more pungent. Social experiment, he corrected, observing me with keen interest. It will run for a total of 10 days. No action is required on your part. You are to remain where you are for the entire duration. You will spend the first 5 days acclimating to your surroundings, but the 5 that follow will be a little more stimulating. Nothing in her tone suggested malice. The way she said it unnerved me. I swallowed. What's on day 5? It seemed as though my apparent fear amused her. Nothing to be concerned about, she smiled. You'll only have to do the thing you do best. An intricate web of scenarios spun through my mind. She'll ask me to fuck her, won't she? No. That's really weird, Oliver. Why even think that? She'll probably use me as a piece of furniture. That's a kink, isn't it? That must be why she's keeping me in this position, to prep me for... I could see her eyeing me with blatant curiosity. I thought you were a journalist? What? I sputtered, my brain working overtime to connect the two. I mean, yes, I am. How in God's grass-fed earth did she know that? At least that's what you indicated in the form you filled out, she added sheepishly, but her eyes gleamed. You work for Affleur magazine? I nodded, despite having no recollection of filling out any form. Of course, I wasn't exactly a cashier at a local newsagent. Affleur was a substantial publication with global offices, its own television channel, and Armani-tiled bathroom. Perhaps she simply recognized me? Was the deceit purposeful? Could I have really signed off on something I don't remember? In that case, the second part of the experiment should be a breeze. The corners of Mrs. Ingram's mouth quivered, as though she was stifling a smile. All you'll have to do is write. In spite of myself, I heaved a sigh of relief, as the mental images of senile pornography and human furniture ebbed from my mind. Write. All I'll have to do is write. Entry 2. Friday, January 7th, 2022. You know, at first, I employed methodical defiance. I mean, despite her best efforts to convince me, I was certain that, wasted or sober, I had never explicitly agreed to be locked up in Mrs. Ingram's cellar. Social experiment, my ass. Why should I bother adhering to any of her demands, even if it was as natural to me as writing? Granted, I started with a measured approach. I figured that if this really was a social experiment, I should be able to withdraw my consent at any point. Right? During the Milgram experiment, participants were led to believe that their involvement was compulsory, despite that not being the case. So I figured all I really had to do was keep asking. But Mrs. Ingram's continued denial of my requests to opt out of the seller newsletter only upped my resolve, eventually resulting in the infamous butt rash. After that ill-famed day, I gave up my feeble attempts at protest. I figured that under the autocratic seller rule, dissent would do more harm than good. Anything you want, she told me, after I had inquired whether she wanted a specific genre. I am not the target audience. She refused to elaborate further, but she wasn't exactly asking me to run a dairy farm. I was a journalist, for God's sake. I could write, and what's more, I could not refute the possibility that Mrs. Ingram was, in fact, crazy. While no expert on human psychology, I was certain that tantrums and retaliation were ill-advised when dealing with nut jobs. If writing several journal entries was what was required to complete this alleged social experiment, then wouldn't I be extending my stay by demonstrating overt non-compliance? I grew bored, painfully so. So I picked up the plastic pen and notepad Mrs. Ingram had graciously supplied me with and started writing, assuring myself that my entries would put Stephen King's Misery to shame. I mean, my situation was inherently worse, isn't it? Paul Sheldon hadn't been tied to a chair. Wait, had he? I mean, I guess my legs weren't broken, yet, and Mrs. Ingram wasn't demanding I write an entire novel, yet. Hello, a nasally voice said. My eyes shot up from my page. Who are you? I squinted into the darkness in front of me. A young man was watching me from the middle of the staircase. About 25, he sported an Adidas shirt and a botched goatee. The pen was suddenly slick between my fingers. I'm Oliver. The man seemed to deliberate this for a moment. Oh, okay. Okay. Just okay. He wasn't at all surprised to find a man tied to a chair in his basement. And what is your name? I asked as colloquially as I could muster. He seemed distant and uninvested. I typically encountered this when interviewing children and knew a change of tone was in order. I haven't seen you around. He shrugged. I'm not allowed to come down here. I stared at him in stunned silence. Wasn't the guy going on 30? You know, he cleared his throat. I really hope you're the one. Mom's tired. A slow chill started creeping up my spine and I held my breath, waiting for him to elaborate, but he stood silent. So this was the son, I thought. His gauche posture and disheveled appearance set him apart quite a bit from his mother. I realized a little too late that he had disregarded my initial question, but somehow his name no longer seemed relevant. What do you mean, I'm the one? I tried to keep my voice level. One of the key principles of interviewing children was maintaining a positive approach while using clear and concise language, and yet the man in front of me was not a child. What the hell did he mean by Mom's tired? Gordon, Mrs. Ingram's voice sounded at the top of the stairs. Gordon, didn't I tell you not to go down there? Come here this instant. Gordon held my gaze for a moment and then turned on his heel, obediently trudging back up the stairs. Just before the door slammed shut, I overheard Mrs. Ingram hiss, "Go play with your train set until dinner." Stared into darkness, my head ringing. What the fuck? I whispered to whatever skeletons lurked in the darkness of the Ingram home. What? Actual fuck. Mrs. Ingram came downstairs again during dinner. I apologized for the earlier misunderstanding. Her tone was laced with sympathy. I've told my son countless times not to disturb our guests, but well, I suppose curiosity is the wick in the candle of learning. She paused as if waiting for me to bring up the other famous saying about curiosity. When I didn't, she continued, Gordon has, she trailed off, a condition. Social cues are challenging for him. I wondered what she expected me to say. I mean, this certainly shed some light on the peculiar mother-son dynamic I'd witnessed earlier, but didn't explain the meaning behind Gordon's strange phrasing. Still, I sure as hell wasn't going to ask Mrs. Ingram about it. I'm sorry, I mumbled. She shook her head. No need to be sorry. We have our hurdles, but we manage. I am doing all that I can to give Gordon the life he deserves. She dabbed her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Here now, eat. You must be starving. I will come by later with your bucket. Entry 3. Saturday, January 8th, 2022. Gordon snuck downstairs again the following day. Albeit having no real means of telling the time, I knew it must have been early. At first I thought it was Mrs. Ingram with my breakfast, and in spite of myself, I perked up. Mrs. Ingram was a fantastic cook, serving up full homemade meals 3 times a day without fail. Her breakfasts were particularly immaculate, with strips of crispy bacon, sunny-side-up eggs, and golden hash brown. "You need to keep your energy up," Mrs. Ingram remarked, loosening the stiff restraint around my neck. "Mental labor is labor." Honestly, the food was so good, I wouldn't have minded if the Ingrams were in fact trying to fatten me up for their own Thanksgiving feast. Almost jittery with delight, I drew in a lungful of air in hopes of smelling what she'd cooked for me that day. My jaw clenched at his nasal greeting, but my disappointment was promptly replaced with frenzy. Without so much as a head nod, I ranked my questions in terms of importance and perceived appropriateness. Mrs. Ingram had been visibly upset the previous night, and her family history seemed no less than harrowing. Perhaps her son simply longed for light conversation? Some non-committal small talk with a stranger. Maybe instead of overanalyzing his remarks, I ought to be focusing on my upcoming release. After all, I technically only had to endure 2 more days of this. "Today didn't hello," Gordon repeated, louder, an edge to his tone. "Are you sleeping?" This question confused me since I was certain he could see that I was awake. Wait, he wasn't blind, was he? "Hello, Gordon." I raised my hand as if to test my theory. He responded with the same, and I heaved a sigh of relief. "What are you doing up so early?" "I came to say goodbye." Alarms blared in my mind. "Goodbye?" He nodded solemnly, turning on his heel and heading back upstairs, when I realized the gravity of my mistake. "No, Gordon, don't go. I was just... Look, I am not sure what you meant." He paused, uncertainty etched into his lips. "Goodbye," he enunciated, as if he thought I was dense. "Goodbye and good luck." Gordon flashed a toothy smile and stuck out a thumbs-up sign as if I'd just won a free milkshake at a drive-thru. "Gordon," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Do you know why I'm here?" He nodded eagerly. "My mom is a doctor." This didn't clear anything up, so I tried again. "Gordon, every time I come here, there's a new one," he piped up again. "A new man that needs help." I blinked, my lungs suddenly devoid of air. "Help?" He furrowed his brow. "Mom said you're very sick. What do you have?" But my throat was dry. "I'm not sick." Gordon let out a nasally chortle. "If Mom can fix you," he said, matter-of-factly, "then all will be well. She is a doctor, and that is what she says sometimes. All will be well. But if she can't..." A thundered upstairs, and Gordon shot an apprehensive glance towards the door. "I have to go now," he set his index finger to his lips. With that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving me with a myriad of unanswered questions, a stripe of goose flesh, and a creeping sense of impending doom. Entry 4. Sunday, January 9th, 2022. "You haven't written very much," Mrs. Leigh Ingram remarked, looking over my measly bundle of pages. I was expecting a bit more from an up-and-coming journalist. I was about to tell her that this up-and-coming journalist got to drink first-rate brandy on weekdays and ride in limousines with C-list actors. Decided to hold my tongue. She didn't seem like the type to be impressed by lavish booze and celebrity gossip. "Sorry," I muttered. "I'll get more done tonight." But Mrs. Ingram shook her head. "I am afraid we are out of time. You'll have to do it during the procedure." My blood ran cold. What procedure? I was convinced she'd get me to do something lighthearted like sign my release forms, but her expression was deadpan. "It's time, Oliver." She placed a hand on my shoulder, causing an immediate outbreak of goosebumps. "Your 10 days are almost up. Time to see if the effort was worth it." I gawped at her, stupefied. "What do you mean?" She was silent, turning her back to me and retrieving a cardboard box from one of the wooden shelf compartments. "I am a trained surgeon," she affirmed, as though this was somehow a redeeming factor. "But you are in capable hands. Brain surgery is my bread and butter at Hopley Hospital, although the typical procedure is not quite..." Blood seeped into my eyelids, painting the entire room a bright red hue. "Wait," I protested. "Brain surgery? Mrs. Ingram, please. Please. Seriously, look, I don't need..." But she raised her palm. "I know." There was a moment of deafening silence. "I know you don't need brain surgery, Oliver," she said once the quiet got too much to bear. "But my son, Gordon, does need a new brain. His condition has no known cure." And she turned away again to rummage through the box she had picked up. But I could hear the rigidity in her jaw as she continued. "And as his mother, I have to find one." Desperation filled my lungs. Look, ma'am, I have money. Lots of it. I can fund research for your son's condition, hire the best professionals, write dozens of articles to spread awareness. I can... And what good will bringing awareness do? Mrs. Ingram's voice was icy cold. My Gordon doesn't need his face plastered across the front page. He needs a new brain. Her grave expression spoke volumes, but she wouldn't relent. And not just any brain. She barked, he must have the best. Mrs. Ingram began arranging medical instruments on the counter beside me. My heart sank as I caught a glimpse of electrical tools, scalpels, and a device resembling a dilator. My brain isn't even close to being the best. I cried, in a feeble attempt to bargain with what little chips I had left. It's not even halfway decent. Mrs. Ingram, I smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and that's on a good day too. And I watch porn. Lots of porn. Have you heard of the one with the man and the jar? Or 2 girls, 1 cup? Well, I've jacked off to both of those. And there was another one with a horse, a black stallion. Your son doesn't need my brain, ma'am. It's a total shitstorm up in there. Mrs. Ingram turned to meet my frantic gaze, clearly amused by my radical change in demeanor. Son, your brain is made up of, well, let's call them compartments for simplicity's sake. There's a designated space responsible for movement, personality, telling right from left, memory, the list goes on. I am not looking to take away your livelihood. The idea is that if the surgery goes according to plan, you'll get to keep your obscene memories, and Gordon will be able to use expressions such as halfway decent. She paused just as Gordon's words echoed in my mind. Every month there's a new one. Of course, you cannot both retain the same aptitude for language, she heaved a sigh. However, I'd say it is a small price to pay in the grand scheme of things. Please, I whispered. How many people have you? She shot me a reproving look as if she knew exactly what I was going to say next. I've tried a total of 8 times. Her tone was flat. Each failed because the brain matter dies before I can preserve it. That's not an excuse to quit trying. Always remember that. Now, you shouldn't feel a thing. I'll just tighten this strap right here. As she spoke, she pulled on the restraint around my neck, pressing my head firmly against the headrest. You should be lucid for the entire procedure. At least that was the way of things last time and the time before that. Here, I'll just numb your scalp, pop it open, take what we need, and you'll be all set. I seemed to be fully numb already, without any anesthetic. Involuntary tears streamed down my cheeks, slipping beneath my shirt collar. And don't worry, Mrs. Ingram suddenly sounded considerably perkier. You can't actually feel your brain, so I'll ask you to continue writing. Or actually, that might not be too comfortable given your position. Careful now, we don't want tear stains on the pages, and I can't have you flailing about like this. Perhaps just finish up the entry now and then we'll get to work. Entry 5. Monday, January 10th, 2022. I was jolted awake by a pounding headache. Fighting the urge to poke through my throbbing temples, I ran my palm across my face. My beard was definitely getting out of hand, but I was still the same old me, only with extra whiskers. Reaching for the glass of water perched on the edge of the countertop, I noticed a couple of aspirin pills laid out next to it. As I popped them onto my parched tongue, I was suddenly overcome with an inordinate sense of gratitude. She'd done it. She really had. What's more, I was alive. Squinting at the primitive light above my makeshift cot, I pulled the covers from my torso and swept a critical gaze over my body. I certainly seemed to be in one piece, save for a few brain cells. Probably. Ah, I called out, half expecting to discover a critical error in my voice. But no, still all there. I couldn't shake the deep sense of gratitude I felt. In fact, I suddenly found myself grappling with emotions more profound than I could fully grasp. Was this what Stockholm Syndrome felt like? But wait, Stockholm Syndrome? Wouldn't that only apply to those in captivity? As promised, the surgery had been totally painless. The entire process was explained to me as it was happening. I learned the names of all the instruments used for the surgery, and was even allowed to hold the hemostatic forceps. Suddenly, brain surgery seemed like a ride along a lazy river. The waiting had, without a shadow of a doubt, been the most terrifying part. I couldn't help raising my brows and mouthing, "That's it," to a cluster of imaginary spectators, awaiting their turn in the fabled chair of doom. My stomach rumbled, demanding sustenance. I wondered what was on the menu this morning. I could have killed for some hash browns and sausage. What time was it? My gaze swiveled to the leftmost side of the room. There he was, still and serene, his eyes gently closed, clearly fast asleep. A trickle of dried blood stamped across his temple. He looked so peaceful, so tranquil. As I jotted down my innermost thoughts in the journal that was set out in front of me, couldn't help feeling pleasantly surprised by the aptitude of my own skill. It seemed as though words were flowing through me in a way they never had before. I thought back to the internet forums I'd frequent that, try as I might, I'd never had the capacity to engage with, and wondered if this time might be different. Perhaps these entries would be my ticket to being part of the outside world. Look, Mom, I flashed the open journal at her as she descended the stairs laden with a wooden breakfast tray. Maybe now I can be a writer too? But don't get too comfortable, because the next story is just as haunting. My roommates and I found a key in our junk drawer. We finally discovered what it opens. I wonder how my life would be now if I hadn't let my idle curiosity get the best of me. No therapy, no doctor's bills, no nightmares. No constantly looking over my shoulder, agonizing over the thought that today could be my last. Though if I do disappear, at least I can leave my story behind. Okay, I can do this. You have a junk drawer in your house, right? Usually it's in your kitchen and holds all your miscellaneous items collected over the years. Our drawer contained a pair of dull scissors, 2 koozies from a DWI law firm, a broken screwdriver, and a brass antique key of unknown origin. Based on its size, the key looked like it opened a jewelry box, but I couldn't be sure. It mainly just collected dust in the back corner of the drawer. I glanced at it every time I needed to grab the scissors and wondered where it came from. My buddy Sam and I moved into the house shortly after we finished grad school. It was an older house, but it had a ton of space and a short commute downtown, where Sam and I both worked. We had another roommate named Rocky, who was a bit older than us. We didn't mind. At the time, I worked in the mayor's office, while Sam worked in finance. Rocky was a line cook at one of the fancier restaurants in town. We all worked long hours, so naturally, we spent a lot of time together. Rocky had a ritual of cooking dinner for us when he returned from a long shift at work, usually drunk, and we became fast friends. He was quite the character, covered in tattoos, and kept his hair wrapped up in a red bandana. I remember that he could fix anything and served as our de facto handyman because our ghost of a landlord was too lazy to make repairs. I assumed the key belonged to Rocky. After all, he liked to collect things, and the house was covered in baubles and trinkets he'd picked up over the years. My favorite being a life-size poster of Jackie Brown in our living room. I asked him about the key one day after a couple of beers, but he had no idea where it came from. The key had been in that drawer ever since he moved in around 10 years ago. Rocky figured it was his old roommate's key and left it alone since the two didn't get along. So that was the end of that. We settled further into our lives for a bit until a rainstorm nearly tore the roof off. Naturally, our landlord went missing, so Rocky had to patch the leak in the attic. I'll never forget that day. Rocky trotted downstairs, soaking wet and covered in dirt, headlamp still lit. "Fellas, I think I found something," he said while grinning. Inside his hands, he held a lockbox. The box was metal, maybe iron, and almost totally rusted. The three of us stared quietly at it, wondering whether we should use the key. "Fuck it, why not?" Sam said, grabbing the key from the drawer. It was a perfect fit, and the eroded lock fell to the ground with a thud. Rocky carefully lifted the top open and turned his headlamp on. "What the fuck?" he whispered. Inside, we found an old composition notebook filled page by page with odd symbols, a military-style compass, a map of Texas, and a faded Polaroid of a young woman with blonde hair smiling at what looked to be a birthday party. The back of the Polaroid listed the coordinates 30.5658882, 95.56981. "Huh," Sam said while looking at his phone. "It looks like these coordinates are in the Sam Houston National Forest. Not too far away at all." "We should go," Rocky yelled. "You two have always talked about taking me camping." It was true. Sam and I were astonished that Rocky, a man of many talents and adventures, had never been camping. We teased him often about it since Sam and I met in the Scouts when we were kids and were well accustomed to the outdoors. Now seemed as good a time as any. Who knows how many people have lived in this house, Rocky pondered. Maybe we'll find something worth keeping. I dream about that day often, locked to a chair and watching the three of us rummage through the box. And I'm pleading, no screaming, for Rocky to throw it away. I can feel my screams turn into laughter, in a voice I don't recognize. We set off a few days later, listening to John Denver and Willie Nelson along the way, while Sam twiddled with his new sat-nav device. The three of us parked our car at base camp and prepared for the 3-mile trek into the unknown, following the trails before the sat-nav incessantly beeped for us to go off the beaten path. We sidestepped broken branches and poison ivy before passing through a wooden archway into another forest clearing. Your destination is 500 meters north, the sat-nav droned. Fucking finally, Rocky muttered. You would have made a terrible scout, Sam teased. Rocky was about to retort, but something made him stop in his track. In front of us lay a path sandwiched by 2 rows of trees. Cloths, tattered t-shirts, and dirty towels hung from their branches. Some looked like they were tied recently, while others were nearly rotted away. I had never seen anything like it. Your destination is in 250 feet. The sat-nav hummed again as we marched forward, gazing at all the trees. At the end of the pathway lay a decaying stone well covered in moss. Arrived, arrived, arrived. The sat-nav yelled at us before going quiet. Jesus, wonder how far down it goes? Sam asked. I picked up a rock and threw it down the well and was almost immediately greeted by a thud. Looks like someone plugged it a while ago, Sam said. Before Sam could finish his next sentence, Rocky had already plunged into the well. What the fuck, Rocky? We both yelled as he disappeared into darkness without a sound. A couple of seconds of silence followed before we saw a flash of Rocky's headlamp. Hey guys, grab the rope. I found something. We pulled Rocky out of the well and cursed at him while he brushed the dirt off. He rolled his eyes and pulled out something from the back of his pants. It was an old wooden box made to look like a small coffin. Someone engraved the same weird symbols from the composition notebook on its top. They'd crudely nailed the coffin shut, and several rusty nails protruded from the bottom. Creepy, Em noted. I know what you're thinking. Are we idiots? Are we blind to the color red? Perhaps so. But back then, I didn't believe in the unknown and only accepted what I knew for certain. Now I can only be certain of my inevitable demise. Rocky cracked open the coffin with his crowbar. It immediately splintered, and a brown mass fell onto the ground. It looked like a primitive doll made out of hard brown clay, with holes for eyes and an agonizing frown on its face. Several faded blonde tufts of hair jutted out of the doll's head. It was then that I felt something off was going on. I felt an inexplicable sensation that someone was watching us. I darted my eyes around but saw nothing, instead noticing that the cicadas had stopped humming. It was deathly quiet, barring a weird clicking sound. Guys, I think we should put that back. I know, I said. Well, fellas, Rocky said, remind me never to go into the attic again. He then launched the doll into the sky. That's not going in the living room. Sam laughed. Well, at least we found something. Come on, let's get out of here and set up camp. We left the clearing and set up at the designated sites. Rocky regaled us with tales from his youth as we drank liquor by the campfire with a woman named Bonnie, whom we met on the trails and was camping with her dog. I had a great time, but as I went to sleep, I couldn't escape the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, we awoke hungover and drove back home, satisfied with our adventure. I think that redhead liked me. I should have given her my number, Rocky muttered, while trying not to hurl. Things soon went back to normal, until one day we received a letter in the mail. Huh, Sam said. Looks like our landlord died. I don't think I ever met her. Yeah, she was like in a coma or something when I moved in, Rocky stated while digging through his backpack. Hey, has anyone seen my bandana? She was in a coma when you moved in? Yeah, something like that. Definitely bedridden. That's why we send our rent checks to the LLC. Huh, always wondered, Em started. Wait, it says here she died in a fall. How can someone in a coma die from a fall? Why would they even tell us how she died? Fuck, I think I left my bandana at the campsite. How am I supposed to go to work? Yeah, I think I left my hat there, Sam said. I have to stop mixing liquors. Rocky threw up his hands in frustration and left for work. It was the last time we saw him alive. I don't know the exact details, but the story is that Rocky stuck his hand in a pot of boiling water and nearly cooked his hand off. We heard from another line cook that Rocky didn't say a word until someone finally noticed what he'd done. It took 4 guys to pull his hand out of the pot, and only then did Rocky scream. We rushed to the hospital, but Rocky had already died by the time we arrived. Doctors said they had him stabilized and were preparing him for surgery before he flatlined. We notified his family and attended his small funeral service in Long Island. Sam and I returned to the house and decided to break our lease. We hired movers to send Rocky's stuff back to his hometown and made plans to move into a new spot. That's when things started getting weirder. We received no communications from the LLC that managed the house. Someone had definitely been in the house while we were gone. Someone moved subtly, and the whole house seemed cleaner. We chalked it up to inspectors preparing the house for viewings, but it felt weird that someone was snooping around while we were gone. I noticed my reading glasses were also missing. The house also felt warm all the time. It was summertime in Texas, so it became almost unbearable to be in the house without the AC on. The thermostat always stayed low, so we figured it was a problem with the HVAC. We knew that new repairs were never going to happen, so we decided to brave it until our new place was ready. 2 weeks was no problem, but soon, we wondered if that was possible. Sam woke up one morning sore and covered in bruises, while the top of my head felt like someone had yanked some hair out of it. Every night started to feel the same. I would try to go to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in our house, poking around even though the nights were deathly silent. Sam finally gave up and told me he was going to spend the rest of the week at his girlfriend. I was welcome to come and sleep on the couch. I told Sam to go ahead and that I would meet him the following night as I needed to pack a bag. Adios, muchacho, Sam said on the way out and closed the door behind him. The next time I saw him was in a funeral casket. Car accident. Sam was on his way to his girlfriend Ally's house when his car veered into a telephone pole at over 90 miles per hour. He died on impact. Nearly every bone was broken in his body. I consoled Ally, felt responsible. She read the autopsy report and noticed that while both arms were almost shattered, Sam's left arm appeared to have broken prior to the crash based on impact. She couldn't get over it and asked if Sam had injured himself earlier that week. I couldn't provide any answer. He was covered in bruises, but I would have noticed if he'd broken his arm. After grieving the loss of my 2 friends, I finally left the house and moved into an apartment across town, falling into a pattern of unhealthy coping mechanisms. One day, I received a package in the mail. The package had no return address. I carefully opened it and was horrified to discover it was the same box from the attic with the original key taped to the front. My stomach churned as I opened the box. It was full of Polaroid. The first Polaroid shows the 3 of us surrounding the well in the forest. Rocky's back is to the camera, but I can tell that he's holding the small coffin we found. The second Polaroid shows Rocky in his sleeping bag by the camp with his red bandana off. The next 3 Polaroids displayed dolls similar to the one we found, except these clearly depicted us. One wore Rocky's bandana, another sported Sam's Chicago Cubs hat, which looked shrunken, and the final one, which appeared to be mine, had jet black hair and seemed made from a different material. All 3 dolls were photographed in the attic. 3 more Polaroids showed what happened to the dolls. Someone set Rocky's doll on fire and twisted Sam's into oblong shapes. They photographed my doll in a different location, resting on a rock in the woods, with a large black crow creeping in the background. I sent the package to the police, who promptly said they would get back to me as they were still investigating Rocky's death. That was 3 months ago. The assigned detective now sends all my calls to voicemail. I've been in therapy ever since the mayor's office demanded I go or lose my job. I've been a distraction at work recently, and probably has to do with my appearance. My skin has been slowly falling off. It started a week after I received the package. I noticed small sores on my legs and feet and immediately went to the doctor, who not only could not identify what caused the sores, but denied they even existed. I refused the referral to a psychiatrist and went to get a second opinion, but they all told me the same thing. Meanwhile, the sores grew larger until the flesh literally dripped off my arms and legs. I received more Polaroids of my doll, taken in the same space but at different times. It appeared to be slowly decaying, starting with the legs and then slowly moving up to its face. In each photo, more crows huddled around the doll. Therapy hasn't helped. My psychiatrist diagnosed me with walking corpse syndrome, rooted in PTSD. Treatment isn't improving, and I'm worried my doctor will institutionalize me. Hopefully, I'll be gone before then they'll see. They'll all see. So I'm here, glued to my screen, as I feel my left eyeball brush against my cheek, typing my story with nothing but bones and spitting out the bile congealed in my throat to warn all of you. The scariest thing you can find isn't a stalker in the woods, a night with no moon, or a monster under your bed. It's a key in the junk drawer. In the dead of night, one nightmare ends, and another begins. I'm begging you, stay out of Aokigahara. Emma and I were always drawn to places with dark histories, the kind most people avoid. So when we planned our trip to Japan, visiting Aokigahara, the infamous suicide forest, was a must. We joked about it over coffee, scrolling through eerie photos and half believing the ghost stories that swirled around this place. It was all fun and games then. Now, I would give anything to undo that decision. We arrived at the forest's edge early, the morning mist still clinging to the ground. The dense canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into strange patterns, making everything feel distant and unreal. The forest seemed peaceful enough at first glance, almost inviting. Emma smirked as we passed a sign in both Japanese and English, warning visitors against venturing off the trails. A grim reminder that many who enter never leave. They put these signs up to scare tourists, I bet, Emma said, her tone teasing, though I could sense a slight tremor beneath her word. Yeah, maybe, I replied, my gaze drifting to the darkened path ahead. I forced a smile, trying to match her bravado, but I couldn't shake the tightness in my chest. Stick close, okay? She laughed. What? You're worried a ghost is gonna snatch me up? I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling. Just don't wander off, Emma. This place is different. We moved deeper into the forest, following the winding trails. At first, it was just us, our footsteps crunching over the old volcanic rock, the occasional bird chirping overhead. But then the air began to change. It felt thicker, heavier, as if the forest was breathing. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Emma seemed less chatty, her steps slower, more deliberate. We came across a series of faint red stains on the ground, leading down further the main path. Emma stopped, her eyes narrowing. Do you see that? Probably from an animal, I said, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. Looks fresh. What if it's hurt? Oh, what if someone is hurt? Her brand for it. Before I could stop her, she was already moving forward, feet crunching leaves as she ventured down the trail, following another trail to the right. Emma, wait, I called. She kept going, ignoring my warning. That's when I saw him. A man standing motionless among the trees, just beyond where Emma was headed. His head lolled to one side, his neck bent at an impossible angle, as if it had been snapped like a twig. His eyes were sunken, dark, his skin pallid and stretched too tight over his bones. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed Emma's arm, yanking her back, but she barely noticed. Who is that? She whispered, as if afraid her voice might shatter him. I don't know. Let's just go, I urged, tugging her, but she wouldn't move. The man began to step forward, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait, and that's when I saw her, a woman following behind him, crawling on all fours like a spider, her limbs twisted and broken in horrifying direction. Her face was a nightmare. Her lower jaw was missing, the back of her head caved in, but her eyes were wide, almost eager. Emma, run! I shouted, panic tightening my throat. We turned and sprinted back the way we came, but the forest seemed different now. Paths twisting, closing in on us. The woman's deformed body scrambled over rocks and roots with alarming speed, moving like a crab, her limbs clicking and snapping as she closed the distance between us. Her ragged breaths filled the air with a sick, wheezing sound. Faster, Emma! I screamed, my legs burning with effort. Emma stumbled, nearly falling, but I grabbed her arm and pulled her up. Go, Go, I yelled, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The woman was close now, her fingers, or what was left of them, scraping at the dirt, leaving a trail of blood in her wake. I could hear her laughing, sound like broken glass grinding together. I risked a glance back and saw her face contorted in a grotesque grin, her eyes gleaming with some hideous glee. We burst into a small clearing, panting, and I dared to hope that maybe we'd lost her. We might be safe. But the man with the broken neck appeared before us, blocking our path, his head twitching as if in silent laughter. Emma screamed as his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with impossible strength. "Let go," I shrieked, grabbing a branch and swinging it wildly. He didn't even flinch. His grip tightened, dragging Emma towards him. The woman with the shattered limbs was upon us now, her jawless mouth opening wide, not unlike a python preparing for a meal. She lunged at Emma's legs, fingers digging in with a sickening crunch. "Help me," Emma cried, terror in her eyes as they began to pull her away, back into the dark. I reached for her. Something held me back. A hand, cold and clammy, wrapped around my ankle. I kicked, struggling, and broke free, watching in horror as Emma was dragged deeper into the forest. Two figures tearing at her clothes, pulling her by her hair, her terrified screams fading into the shadows. "No," I shouted, racing after her, but I felt the ground give way. My feet slipping over loose dirt, crashed to my knees, pain exploding through my body. The woman with the broken limbs began crawling toward me again, her body twisting and contorting in ways that defied reason. I scrambled back, my breath coming in frantic gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear them dragging Emma, hear her cries, and then nothing. Only the sound of leaves rustling, the distant creak of branches. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in the back of an ambulance, shivering, covered in dirt and scratches. They kept asking me what happened and where my sister was, but I couldn't form the words. All I could do was stare back at the trees. And then I saw her, Emma, standing at the edge of the forest, her body pale and gaunt. She was waving at me, a slow, lifeless motion. Her chest had a gaping hole where her heart should have been, face blank. I lost consciousness before the ambulance doors closed, but I couldn't unsee it. Her hollow, dead eyes locked onto mine, forever calling me back into the darkness. "Please, I beg of you, stay out of Aokigahara. The horror doesn't end here. There's more lurking in the darkness. My life is slowly being taken over by somebody or something else. Please help me." It started off innocuously enough, misplacing things and being generally forgetful. I put it down to tiredness and stress until I couldn't. I'd wake up with strange, barely visible marks on my body. Things started feeling badly wrong at this point, deep down in my gut. It screamed at me, unintelligibly, but screaming nonetheless. Then came the photos. Again, it started off in a manner such that I was able to lie to myself just about enough to maintain my sanity. Stuff showing up in my camera roll I didn't remember taking or being in after a drunken night out. People I didn't remember being with or didn't even recognize at all. Things I wouldn't have ever done anyway, like the 3-minute video of me singing karaoke at the bar we'd hang out at every weekend. I hated karaoke, always had, but there I was, bellowing the words to Holding Out for a Hero, like my life depended on it. I tried to shake it off as best I could and get on with living my life. That proved far too difficult. As if in tune with my very thoughts themselves, the marks I'd wake up grew larger and more painful, the more I tried to ignore it all. At this point, I'd had enough, and given the doctor's inability to either explain or help in any meaningful way, I decided to figure it out on my own. I went online and ordered a camera tucked away into an unsuspecting nightstand lamp and proceeded to position it as best I could the night it arrived. Now, I'd never been one to believe in the paranormal, so what exactly I expected to come of this gambit, I'm not quite able to explain. I'm not sure I can explain what actually came of it either. I woke up exhausted the next morning, eager to find out what the camera captured. Strangely, and for the first time since all the weirdness began, I woke up mark-free. Not a strand of hair was out of place. Plugged the tiny USB component of the lamp into my laptop, and upon navigating to the newest recording, pressed play. 8 hours was far more time than I could bear to sit through, and I motioned to fast forward before something caught my attention. was barely visible at first, nothing more than a shadow lingering in the corner of the room just beyond my. And the features came into focus. Jet black hair, a wiry frame, familiarity. Too much familiarity. Me. I'm sure most of you have heard of that one theory behind the uncanny valley phenomenon. The one that claims it's something that evolved within us eons ago, as there was something out there that looked just like us. Almost exactly like us. But not quite. On the surface, there I was, standing over myself. But even there, whilst staring at a grainy video shot in the dark, feel it. Instinct. Couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about that thing standing there was off. Badly. Following days were a blur. The occurrences that led to my grand hidden camera idea only grew in number and seriousness following my discovery. The marks I woke up were now freshly bleeding, undiscovered. Photos I didn't recognize were straying further and further away from my actual life. Photos of me doing terrible, heinous things were invading my camera roll like parasites. Photos that, anybody were to see them, would end my life as I knew it. I was at my wit's end, considering going to the police even. I knew they wouldn't believe me. I wouldn't believe me, either. The one piece of evidence I had would have taken an amateur video editor less than an hour to make. I went to bed last night defeated beyond belief, wishing for nothing more than for this to finally end, one way or the other. In a twisted way, I suppose I may get my wish soon. Work was supposed to start early today, and after a shower and a quick coffee, I was all ready to leave. I was just about to swing the front door open when I noticed a small white slip of paper lying beneath my feet. Polaroid photo was attached to it. The word copy was scrawled in the white space framing the photo. At the same time, a text notification pinged. It was from my boss. Thanks for letting me know you won't be able to make it in today. Get well soon. My heart sank and I bent over to grab whatever was beneath me. Photo of me, gripping a bloody knife. A guy and a girl in their early 20s maybe, slumped at my feet, drained of anything even resembling life. I wore a sick smile on my face, a smile of deceit, satisfaction. Beyond our shared knowledge, I was it, and it was me, a memento of a job well done. And the note? One word, shh. If you think that was terrifying, wait until you hear what happens next. Faceless one. Moving into a new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. After a few rough years, I needed a place where I could settle down, focus on my work, and maybe even meet some new people. The neighborhood seemed perfect, quiet, clean, and close to the city, but with a small-town vibe. The apartment itself was just right. Cozy one-bedroom with big windows that let in plenty of light. Felt like a place where I could finally breathe again. I spent the first few days getting settled, unpacking boxes, and arranging furniture. Everything was going smoothly, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. The neighbors seemed friendly, though I hadn't interacted much with them yet. I'd pass them in the hallway or see them in the courtyard, always offering a polite smile or a nod, which they returned. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, were still neighborly. But something was off. Even from the beginning. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Just a vague sense of unease that would wash over me at odd moments. It was nothing concrete, just the feeling that something wasn't right. It started small, little things that were easy to dismiss. I'd run into a neighbor on the stairs or in the hallway, and they'd smile and say hello. But later, when I tried to recall the encounter, couldn't remember what they looked like. Their faces seemed to blur in my memory, as if they were out of focus in a photograph. I shrugged it off, blaming it on the stress of the move, the newness of the place. After all, I was bad with faces to begin with. But as the days went on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. One evening, about a week after I'd moved in, I had an unsettling experience that I couldn't shake. I was coming back from a late-night grocery run when I ran into one of my neighbors in the lobby. She was an older woman, with gray hair pulled back into a bun, dressed in a simple floral dress. She smiled at me, and we exchanged pleasantries. "Late night?" she asked. "Yeah," I replied, holding up the grocery bag. "Needed a few things." She nodded, her smile warm but odd. Something about her smile didn't seem quite right. It was too wide, too perfect, as if it were pasted onto her face. "Well, good night," she said, and I mumbled a goodnight in return as I headed towards the elevator. As I rode up to my floor, I tried to picture her face again, but it was a struggle. Her features were already slipping away, melting into an indistinct blur. By the time I reached my apartment, I could barely remember what she looked like at all. That night, I had trouble sleeping. My dreams were filled with shadowy figures, their faces hidden in darkness, watching me, whispering in voices I couldn't understand. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the images from the dream lingering in my mind. The next morning, I decided to shake off the unease. It was just a dream, I told myself. The move had probably thrown me off more than I realized. I needed to get out, take a walk, clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and headed out. As I walked through the courtyard, I saw a few of my neighbors sitting on benches, reading or chatting quietly. I waved to one of them, a man in his 30s with dark hair. He waved back with that same odd, too wide smile. I kept walking, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. There was something wrong with the way they moved, the way they looked at me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that they were still watching me, their faces turned towards me, their eyes blank and expressionless. I hurried out of the courtyard, trying to shake off the fear that was creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just paranoia, I told myself. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But as the days went on, the strange encounters continued. I started avoiding my neighbors, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, keeping my head down when I walked through the courtyard. But no matter how much I tried to avoid them, they were always there, watching me with those unsettling smiles. One evening, I was sitting in my apartment, trying to focus on some work, when I caught my reflection in the window. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. My face looked pale and drawn, my eyes sunken and hollow. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind. It was just stress, I told myself. I needed to get a grip. But the next time I looked in the mirror, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. My features were fading. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. There was no mistaking it. The lines of my face seemed softer, less distinct, as if they were being erased bit by bit. I stared at my reflection, my heart pounding. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of hallucination? I splashed water on my face, hoping to snap out of it. But when I looked in the mirror again, the fading was still there, even more pronounced than before. Fear that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind now took hold, gripping me with icy fingers. I had to know what was happening. I had to find out the truth about this place, about my neighbors, about myself. I started asking around, trying to get information about the building and its residents, but I hit a wall at every turn. No one seemed to know much about the place, and those who did were evasive, giving me vague answers and avoiding eye contact. It was as if the entire neighborhood was in on some kind of secret, one they weren't willing to share. My anxiety grew with each passing day. My reflection continued to fade, and I became more and more isolated, avoiding everyone, even my friends and family. I couldn't let them see what was happening to me, couldn't explain it without sounding insane. The final straw came one night when I woke up to a sound in my apartment. Soft, shuffling noise, like someone was moving around in the darkness. My heart leaped into my throat as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. I grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand and crept out of bed, my hands trembling. As I approached the door, the noise stopped, and an eerie silence filled the room. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, fear rooting me in place. Finally, I mustered the courage to open the door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I shone the flashlight down the corridor, but there was nothing there, no sign of anyone or anything. But as I turned to go back to bed, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Wet footprint, leading from the front door down the hallway and stopping right outside my bedroom. I followed the trail, my heart racing, and when I reached the front door, I found it slightly ajar. Someone had been inside my apartment, and they had left without making a sound. I locked the door, every nerve in my body on high alert. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, had to leave before whatever was happening to me became irreversible. But as I turned to gather my things, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway mirror, and what I saw nearly brought me to my knees. My face was almost completely gone. My features had smoothed over, leaving only a blank, featureless surface where my eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. I stared at the reflection, horror coursing through me, but the face that stared back was no longer mine. In a panic, I ran out of the apartment, fleeing down the stairs and into the night. I didn't stop until I was far from the building, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. I had to leave, had to get as far away from this place as possible. But where could I go? How could I escape something that was happening to me from the inside out? In desperation, I found a hotel on the other side of town and checked in, hoping that distance would break the hold the apartment seemed to have on me. I locked myself in the room and avoided mirrors, too afraid of what I might see. But the next morning, when I looked in the bathroom mirror, the horror was still there. My face was now completely blank, just a smooth, featureless surface staring back at me. I was becoming one of them, one of the faceless one. I had to stop it. I had to find a way to reverse whatever had been done to me before it was too late. I spent the next few days researching frantically, poring over old records, news articles, anything I could find about the building and the neighborhood. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the information became. The neighborhood wasn't cursed, as I'd initially feared. It was something else, something far more terrifying. The apartment complex had been the site of an experiment decades ago, one that had gone horribly wrong. It had been a psychological study conducted in secret, where residents were unknowingly subjected to extreme isolation and sensory deprivation. The experiment had been shut down after multiple residents were driven mad or simply disappeared. But the effects lingered, a residual force that still permeated the walls of the building. Over time, the neighborhood itself became infected with this presence, warping the reality of anyone who lived there too long. The faceless ones were the remnants of those who had succumbed to the experiment, their identities stripped away, their minds hollowed out until they were nothing more than empty shells. They were still alive, in a sense, but without faces, without memories, without selves. They were the perfect subjects eternally trapped in the aftermath of the experiment. And now I was becoming one of them. I didn't have much time. The more I thought about it, the more I could feel the presence creeping into my mind, unraveling the threads of who I was, who I had been. My memories were slipping away, and with them, my sense of self. I had to find a way to escape this fate, to reclaim my identity before it was too late. In my research, I found references to a man who had survived the experiment, one of the original residents who had managed to escape before it claimed him. He was now living as a recluse, far from the city, trying to put the horrors of the past behind him. Desperate, I tracked him down, hoping he might have the answers I needed. I found him living in a small, dilapidated cabin on the edge of a forest, far from civilization. He was an old man now, frail and worn, but his eyes were sharp, filled with a haunted knowledge. He listened as I told him my story, nodding slowly, as if he had been expecting me. "You can't escape it," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Not completely, but you can fight it. You can reclaim yourself." He told me that the only way to resist the effects of the experiment was to reconnect with who I was. My memories, my identity, my essence. Had to anchor myself in the reality of who I was before the experiment could take it all away. He handed me an old journal, zoned from the days when he had been a resident in that cursed building. It was filled with notes, memories, and thoughts, his way of holding on to himself during the experiment. He urged me to do the same, to write down everything I could remember about myself, to hold on to those memories as if my life depended on it. Because it did. I returned to the hotel and began writing furiously, trying to capture every memory, every detail about my life before it all faded away. It was exhausting, mentally and emotionally, but I felt the presence weakening with each word I wrote. The more I focused on my identity, the less power it had over me. The battle wasn't over. The faceless ones knew I was fighting back, and they weren't going to let me go so easily. That night, as I was writing, I heard the shuffling footsteps again, this time inside the hotel room. My heart pounded as I turned to face the mirror, and there they were, standing behind me, their featureless faces reflecting back at me. their blank eyes staring into mine. They reached out with their hands, but this time, I was ready. I clutched the journal to my chest, refusing to let them take me. I focused on my memories, on the life I had lived, and the person I was. And then in a moment of clarity, I spoke my name out loud, my voice firm and resolute. I am Junior. I am not one of you. The faceless ones hesitated, their hands faltering, and in that moment, I felt a surge of strength, of self. I pushed back against their presence, forcing them out of the room, out of my mind. They disappeared, vanishing into the darkness, and I collapsed onto the bed, exhausted but victorious. I knew then that I had won, that I had reclaimed myself from the grip of the experiment. My reflection in the mirror was my own again, my features clear and distinct. I was whole, and I would remain that way, as long as I held on to my memories, to my identity. I left the city the next morning, leaving the apartment, the neighborhood, and the faceless ones behind. I would never return, but I would carry the journal with me always, a reminder of who I was and what I had fought to preserve. Because in a world where identity can be stolen, where memories can be erased, holding on to oneself is the greatest victory of all. Just when you thought it was safe, another story creeps into the darkness. My son told me that he ate his teacher. I'm starting to believe him. Hey kiddo, how was school? I asked as Dylan trudged through the door. I received no response, just a shrug as he tossed his backpack aside. That type of behavior had become increasingly more common since his father had walked out on us 3 months prior. I had come to expect a bit of a struggle when it came to opening up to me, but his refusal to make eye contact indicated that something was wrong. Dylan, did something happen at school today? He meekly glanced up at me, swinging his foot back and forth. Yeah. What was it, sweetie? You can always tell me if someone's bothering you. He muttered under his breath, shifting his gaze to the floor. I'm sorry, honey. What was that? I ate my teacher, Mrs. Hollingsworth. I ate her. I was momentarily stunned. What kind of weird confession was that? I was expecting him to tell me that he flunked a math test or got a conduct mark. It was totally out of left field. I was at a loss for words. Why did you do that? I replied, opting to play along. This had to be some type of game. He bit his lip, and I could see tears welling in his eyes. Got to write my spelling word, so Mrs. Hollingsworth gave me more homework. Crossed my arms. Well then, it sounds to me like Mrs. Hollingsworth had it coming. Go get a jump on today's assignments so you don't have to eat any more teachers, all right? Dylan's face lit up like a firework on the 4th of July. Okay, I will. Thanks for not being mad, he said, grabbing his backpack as he bolted to his room. What am I going to do with that boy? He chuckled, turning my attention back to the pot roast simmering on the stove. The next day, I had to drop Dylan off at school myself. For the first time ever, he'd missed the bus. I really didn't mind taking him. It would give me a chance to ask Mrs. Hollingsworth if she knew anything about his odd revelation. But Mrs. Hollingsworth wasn't there. She had a substitute filling in for her. I thought it was a strange coincidence. Nothing to worry about. Surely she was just sick, right? Now, I'm starting to think that's not the case. I was again in the kitchen cooking dinner when I heard the familiar slam of the front door and little feet darting down the hall. Hey, buddy. Silence. Nothing, aside from the door to Dylan's room clicking shut. Odd, but not too out of the ordinary. At least, not until supper. Dylan, time for dinner. Just a second. No, food's ready now. Come get it. I said just a second. My blood began to boil. Who the hell did he think he was talking to? I marched up to Dylan's door and threw it open, exposing him playing a new video game. Dylan Lane Webster. You listen. No, Jessica. You listen to me. My blood turned to ice. Dylan had never addressed me by my first name before. His voice was suddenly so deep and sinister. When my son turned to face me, I didn't recognize the eyes that locked with mine. Leave me alone, or I will consume you, mind, body, and soul, just like I did to your husband. All the blood rushed from my face, and I felt as if I was going to pass out. Did I hear that correctly? Boop. What did you say? I squeaked, my voice shaky and uneven. Dylan didn't respond. He just kept battling his way through digital zombies on the television screen. I stumbled away, afraid that I was going to faint. I made it to the sofa in the living room, fighting through tears and the nauseating feeling in my gut. Dylan's strange confession suddenly didn't feel like a quirky little game anymore. Once I managed to ground myself in reality, I determined that I needed to know. If eating people was jargon for some other method of making them disappear, I was going to get to the bottom of it. I raced to my bedroom and began rifling through the drawer of my bedside table. I tossed aside trinkets and papers until I found what I was looking for. The note from the day that John had left. I'd kept it in case I needed it for legal proceeding. And in that moment, I thanked my lucky stars that I did. I turned on the lamp by my bed and began inspecting the note. My heart dropped when I noticed it. Just what I was afraid of. The letter had been hastily scrawled in Dylan's handwriting. My head spun violently as I compared the note to a letter that Dylan had penned a few months prior. There was no mistaking it. My husband didn't write that note. My son did. I began to hyperventilate as the weight of the implications bore down on me. This was all too crazy to wrap my head around. My husband, the man whom I had built a life with for over 10 years, might not have walked out on me. It's too much to process. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, sunlight was flooding into my eyes and I could feel little fingers tugging at my blouse. Mommy, I missed the bus again. Can you take me? I groggily opened my eyes and glanced at the alarm clock. 7:45. I shot up from bed, trying to get my bearings. I'd been knocked out for a whole 12 hours. How was that possible? I didn't have time to mull it over. I ushered Dylan out of the room while I raced around like a bat out of hell. Come on, buddy. Mommy overslept, I said, emerging with my top halfway on 5 minutes later. All the while, Dylan stood there, quiet as a church mouse. We were only 15 minutes late. Not bad, all things considered. I peered through the door to Dylan's class when I dropped him off. Mrs. Hollingsworth still wasn't there. That was enough to bring all of the events from the night prior crashing to the forefront of my mind. That was right. I was looking into my husband's disappearance. I flew home to go over the evidence once more. I made it back in record time, and I immediately started searching for the note that I'd discovered the night before. But it was gone. I searched up and down for it, in the drawer, under the bed. I even rifled through all the trash cans. Nothing. I knew for a fact that I hadn't thrown it out. So did Dylan take it? That was the only logical explanation. He must have disposed of the letter to erase any proof of his wrongdoing. That, or I was starting to lose it. I honestly couldn't tell which was worse. I took a series of deep breaths and closed my eye. I knew what I had to do, but I wasn't sure if I had the resolve to go through with it. I unlocked my phone and thumbed through the contacts, pausing when I reached the name I was searching for. My thumb hovered over the call button for a long time. Before I finally pressed it, my heart jackhammered in my chest. Every ring. Just when I thought it was going to go to voicemail, she answered. Hello? Hi, Mrs. Daniels. It's Jess. I could hear an audible groan from the other end of the line. What do you want? I wanted to snap back at her with every fiber of my being, but fortunately, I managed to keep my composure. I was just wondering if you'd heard from John recently. He hasn't been home in a few days. She scoffed. I ain't heard from that boy since his papa's funeral, no thanks to you. Okay, that's all I needed, thanks. I hung up before she could get another word in. John's mother really didn't like me, but she was the only one I could have asked. His father had passed away when he was in college, and he had no other living relatives to speak of. It was beginning to dawn on me that John might not have left of his own free will a few months back. He worked from home and only hung out with friends every few months or so. His employer had probably assumed that he'd found another job, and that going ghost was his way of submitting his resignation. John was the type of person who could disappear, and no one would bat an eye. No one, except for me. I was fairly certain then that if Dylan didn't directly cause my husband's disappearance, he had a hand in it at the very least. I was starting to think that my outlandish theory about eating people being code for something wasn't so crazy after all. Still, though, I needed evidence. I was going to have to catch Dylan in the act. I decided that my best course of action would be to keep a close eye on him while I could brainstorm a more concrete plan. I had to be cautious about things so that he wouldn't follow through on his threat. When Dylan arrived home from school, I put on my best poker face. A whirlwind of emotions surged through me, but I kept repeating to myself that I only needed to stick it out for a bit longer. Little did I know, that sentiment held more truth than I ever would have thought. "Hey buddy, how was your day?" I asked, beaming at my son as he trudged through the door. "It was good, Mommy. Can we go to the park later? Pretty please? My friend wants to meet me there." I eyed him skeptically. "Oh yeah? And who might this friend be?" Dylan glanced down and shoved his hands into his pocket. "Josh, you don't know him." And how did you meet this Josh?" "On the playground." "Please, Mommy, I really want to go," Dylan insisted, grabbing my hand with his little fingers and staring up at me with pleading eyes. I pretended to mull it over, shifting my gaze to the ceiling. "Okay, we can go, but only after you finish your homework. Deal?" "Deal. You're the best," he shouted before darting off to his room. Perfect. This would give me a chance to observe Dylan's behavior around other kids. Felt wrong to be going behind my son's back like that, but I had to get to the bottom of things. Dylan and I left for the park around 5 o'clock. When we arrived, a handful of children were already romping around the playground. Once we were within view, a boy with sandy hair and a gap-toothed grin waved Dylan over. My son gave me a quick glance before darting off to meet his friend. I claimed a seat on an empty bench and pulled out a book from my purse. I must have let myself get sucked in, because when I looked up, I experienced every parent's worst nightmare. Couldn't find Dylan. I leapt up from the bench and hurriedly scanned the playground. He was nowhere in sight. "Dylan, Dylan, where are you?" I yelled, my heart thundering in my chest. While I was suspicious of him, Dylan was still my son. He was my entire world, and I would be absolutely devastated if anything happened. I rushed over to the nearest adults and pleaded with them to help me. Fortunately, they were a sweet elderly couple watching their granddaughter swing on the monkey bars. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you, but I can't find my son. His name is Dylan, and he's about this tall with brown hair and blue eyes. I'm pretty sure he has a Reptar shirt on. Have you seen him?" The old woman innocently met my gaze and returned a warm smile. "As a matter of fact, I have." "That wouldn't happen to be him, would it?" she asked, pointing to the nearby tree line. She was right. There was Dylan, leading his new friend into the woods. "Thank you so much," I said, before trotting over to the trees. Why was Dylan going in there? He was never one to venture off without my permission. I followed the duo into the underbrush. I was about to call Dylan's name to get him to come back. Whatever was going on, I wanted no part of it. But in the end, my curiosity won out. I tailed behind the boys, keeping a safe distance and ensuring that I didn't make too much noise. They paused in a clearing. I watched as Dylan surveyed his surroundings. Quickly ducked behind a bush, barely escaping his line of sight. I had to work to stifle my breathing. Feeling of dread had settled into my stomach. My intuition was telling me that something sinister was about to happen. I peeked my head out from my hiding spot. I nearly passed out right there. I stayed crouched, frozen in terror, as my son pushed Josh to the ground with a strength that I didn't know he was capable of. He loomed over him and whispered something inaudible. Then his jaw unhinged like an anaconda and began to stretch, wider and wider and wider, until his mouth was nearly the size of a toddler. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Josh was visibly shaking. The poor boy was paralyzed, unable to tear his eyes away from the twisted scene before him. And then, without warning, Dylan pounced. He grabbed Josh and shoved his head inside his gaping maw. He fed his body through the opening, swallowing him inch by inch. The child's guttural shrieks resonated in my ears, growing more and more muffled with each passing second. Once Josh's shoes had disappeared down Dylan's throat, his mouth returned to its normal size. What he did next will haunt me for the rest of my life. Without turning around, Dylan calmly said, "Mommy, if you tell anyone about what you just saw, you will be my next meal." The chill in the air is only growing stronger as another tale emerges from the shadows. It's there, until it isn't. Hello, this has been an extraordinary ordeal. With a lack of concrete evidence, it's hard for me to turn to anyone else, so it will have to be you read it. Apologies in advance, I am a dyslexic fuck. The other day, me and my pal Ryan went for a walk up High Down. We live close to the South Downs, so hiking has been a regularity in my life. It's a quaint hill with a decent view of the south coast. We chatted and shot the shit as friends do. Now, I'm unsure if the next part is connected, but for the sake of context, I'm going to outline everything that may hold significance. I haven't been up high down since I was maybe 18. I'm 25 now. I moved away from my hometown in the pursuit of bigger things, but ended up back here, as you do. Anyway, as we were up there, we both noticed something we had not noticed before. It was a stone grave. One of those ones that is erected like a stone coffin about 5 feet in height. It had metal fencing around it, tight to the perimeter of the grave. This fencing was old too, similar to the spikes you find around old fancy houses. Next to it stood a plaque. The story it told in short is of a man who lived secluded up on this hill in a small shed. He built his grave 30 to 40 years before his death and lived right next to it. He planned his funeral and everything years before his death as well, which in those times was strange. A very eccentric guy. Plaque's words, not mine. At the time, I remember thinking, this is how unimpressive our town is. This guy taking out a funeral plan in the 1800s is our biggest feat. We walk on, laughing about the unimportance of this man's life and the gravity our town had decided to give him. We sat at the top of the hill, looking over the towns and cities. We looked over at our town, probably a couple of miles out from where we were. Now you have to understand when I say this, we both know this town in and out. We have walked around aimlessly drunk high for hours at a time. We know every nook and cranny of this little English nightmare. So we sat there playing who is more geographically impaired, pointing out places and trying to work out what they are, challenging each other on location. Then we noticed this one building off to the side of our town. Big, gray, and has no windows. Smoking, but it was hard to know where from at that distance. Ryan speculated it was the leisure center, but that place has windows. Some unknown warehouse, potentially, I thought. Honestly, I hadn't been back all that long, so it wasn't that strange for me. But Ryan was perplexed. We looked it up on Google Maps, but as we were eyeballing the distance, we couldn't pinpoint its location. We were pretty high at this point, so Ryan got fixated on working out what this place was. Thought it would be fun to try and locate it. I hadn't seen Ryan in a while, so I was happy to extend the walk. We made a mental note of its position in relation to known landmarks and headed on our way. After hours of walking, readjusting, walking again, we found nothing. No building, no smoke. As you come down high down, you lose sight of your surroundings due to the tree line. But we were unable to keep an eye on it the whole time. After that day, this all melted into the background of my brain. The stone-over ensued, and memories of that day blurred. About a week later, Ryan messaged me. He wanted to go up high down again. I accepted, and we met there. As we walk up the hill, he is trying to peer through the tree line. I don't think much of it at the time. We make it to the top, and he immediately turns to look at our town and points. There. Tell me I'm not crazy. You see that, right? I turn to look and see the building again, smoking as it was before. Maybe how it had always been. I've been up here every day since we last met. It's always there. It's always smoking. He seemed a little frantic at this point. I've searched every day. I come up here, I look at the building, I go down, I search, but nothing. Can't find shit. I'm a little worried about him, so I ask him if he's all right. He seems agitated by the question, and in his own words, politely informs me that this hangout session is over. Again, life got in the way, and I slowly forgot about this strange turn of events. About a week later, I message Ryan to meet up again. No response. I assume he's pissed off about me being condescending, so I rock up to his house uninvited. I knock, and his mom answers the door. First thing she asks me before I can even get a word out is, "Have you seen Ryan?" The question is simple enough, but it lingers in my mind. No, that's actually why I came over. She seemed distressed. He didn't come home a few days ago, and I haven't seen him since. I don't know if I should call the police. He's 24, he's a grown man, and he's entitled to his space, but you should definitely call the police, I replied. Been 5 days since I spoke to Ryan's mom. Still no sign of him. The police have been looking for him, but no lead. I go up to high down every day, and there it is. Big, gray, and smoking. Do you want to know what scares me the most? I have tried to show others the building, They can't see it. The night is far from over. Let's dive deeper into the darkness. The night that changed my life. Time slip experience. Hey guys, I need to share something bizarre that happened to me, which I've been unable to get out of my head. I was also thinking if I should post this or not. I experienced a time slip, and it's as puzzling today as it was then. I was parked outside my parents' house with my sister. She left the car to head inside, and as she did, I took a look at the car dashboard, and it was exactly 1 a.m. That's the last normal moment I remember, because what happened next is something I still don't have an explanation for till this day. I am suddenly in my street where I live, which is about a 25-minute drive from my parents' house. I wasn't right in front of my house, but close enough to see it. I could hear people cheering loudly in the background, like in being in the middle of a live World Cup soccer game. To my left, there was this orange, energy-like orb floating near the ground, almost as if it was going to race me. And on my right side, I'm looking and I'm seeing an old man in a huge, long, weird, some kind of magician-looking robe. He was counting down loudly, starting from 5, down to 1. And I swear, on everything that is dear to me, I still remember when he was counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2. And when he came to 1 and said it, 1, bam, I hear this loud bang on my car window. And I'm looking around and I see a cop pointing his flashlight at my face and shouting, "Are you sleeping behind the wheel? Get out of the car, now." Now I'm looking at this police officer and realizing that I'm literally in front of a police station, right on the road, my car still in drive mode, D. This is about 25 minutes from my parent place and maybe 5 minutes away from where I live. I looked at my dashboard and it was 5 a.m. 4 hours just disappeared like that. And there I was, standing there, just shocked, looking at the officer that is asking me all these questions. Why am I here? Where are you going? Did you sleep? Are you on drugs? Etc. And I am just completely flabbergasted. I'm looking around at the officer and looking around me, and as if I noticed that there were no cars, no people, nobody in sight. I was literally standing on the road in the middle, exactly in front of the police station. 4 hours later, that thing I saw with the old man and the orb lasted only maybe 5 seconds, at least in my head or how I experienced. So I don't know how I got to slip 4 hours. I look at my phone and see that I got like 100 missed calls from my wife, maybe another 100 from my parents, and various other calls from friends that my wife had woken up in the middle of the night to ask if they know anything. I don't know if I should go on or... I've been thinking about this every single day, and this happened to me 10 months ago. Until this day, I still can't find an answer to what happened. Whenever I tell someone, they look at me like I'm crazy or possessed. Anybody knows anything or how, please tell me, as I'm dying to get answers. Thank you guys. Anybody tell me what happened, please? I'm dying to get any answers. Hold your breath, because the next story will take it away. If you work in a hospital without mirrors, run. I was never one to believe in the supernatural. I always relied on science and empirical data as my guides, especially in my work. I've been a nurse for about 5 years, and I've faced difficult situations, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened at St. Agnes Hospital, where I worked about 3 months ago. St. Agnes was a relic of the past, an old hospital in a forgotten part of the city where time seemed to have stopped. I didn't have many job options at the time and had some debts to pay, so I accepted the offer to work the night shift. The pay was good and the work seemed straightforward. I expected just a few uneventful nights, but on my first day, I realized something was wrong. First of all, as I mentioned, it was a very old hospital, originally built as a kind of sanatorium for people with a rare dermatological condition known as Eagle syndrome. It's a little-known disease that requires an adapted lifestyle, including very low exposure to light. Because of this, the hospital had an oppressive atmosphere. The hallways were long, dark, and the lights flickered constantly. The decor, too, was eerie. Wooden panels showing signs of age and portraits of the hospital's founders and early staff seemed straight out of a horror movie. It was almost as if their eyes followed you as you walked by. There was, of course, an absolute silence. broken only by the distant hum of some medical equipment. Felt like the building itself was alive, breathing in unison with its inhabitants. My first night was quiet, but I felt an inexplicable unease. There was something in the corridors, something I couldn't identify, but I knew it was there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger that feeling became. Eventually, I distracted myself by organizing some supplies, convincing myself that it was just my mind adjusting to the night shift. The only thing that really caught my attention was when I used the bathroom. I finished what I had to do and washed my hands, but when I went to check my reflection, there was no mirror. In the bathroom, in the corridors, in the nurses' stations, there wasn't a single mirror anywhere. I knew this was unusual, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I let it go. I just mentioned it to another nurse. Oh, it's to avoid scaring the patients. They don't like mirrors much, and sometimes they can reflect light from somewhere. That was enough to convince me. In the second week, I was assigned to care for a particular patient. His condition was pitiful. His appearance was extremely pale, sunken eyes. He had been rushed to the hospital without identification and was in a constant state of delirium. His eyes were glazed, and he murmured incomprehensible things, words I couldn't understand, but that caused me a deep sense of discomfort. While checking his vital signs, he suddenly became agitated, grabbing my arm with a strength I didn't expect from someone in his condition. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, felt like he was trying to tell me something important, but all that came out were incoherent whispers. He kept repeating something like ood or ood, but I couldn't make it out. Before I could react, he lunged at me, biting my arm with desperate force. I felt a sharp pain, and my immediate reflex was to push him away with all my strength. He fell back onto the bed, looking exhausted, and I stood there, breathing heavily, holding my now bleeding arm. The on-call doctor appeared soon after, drawn by the noise, but his reaction was strangely apathetic. He looked at the man with a mix of pity and annoyance, as if it were a minor inconvenience. "He's delirious," the doctor said distantly. "Calm him down with a sedative." I wanted to question him, to say the patient needed more than just a sedative, but something in the doctor's look made me hesitate. I did as he asked, and after sedating the patient, retreated to the nurse's station, trying to push the incident out of my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep when I got home. The pain in my arm still throbbed, and the experience lingered in my mind, which was already a mess. But I needed to go back to work the next day. About 3 days later, the atmosphere in the hospital was even heavier. It was as if the air was charged with electricity, almost difficult to breathe. The corridors seemed even darker, and the silence deeper. I felt a constant presence, as if I were being watched, but every time I looked back, there was nothing, just the cold, silent emptiness. During my shift, I decided to check on the patient who had bitten me the previous night. When I entered the room, I found him motionless, almost like a corpse. His skin was even paler, and his lips were stained crimson. The monitor next to the bed showed weak but present vital signs. However, what disturbed me the most was a seemingly trivial detail: the reflection on the steel tray I was holding. There was no reflection. The bed was there, the equipment was there, but the patient wasn't. Fear began to form in my stomach, rising to my throat. I tested it again, changing the tray's position. The result was the same. My mind tried to rationalize it, but my instinct screamed that this was not natural, that I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I stood in shock for a few seconds, unable to process what I was seeing. Then, old hand touched my shoulder, and I almost screamed. It was one of the veteran nurses with a neutral expression on her face. "Is everything okay?" she asked casually. I hesitated, but eventually nodded. I didn't know what to say, or if I should say anything at all. Everything felt so surreal, as if I were trapped in a nightmare. I decided to leave the room and continue my shift, trying to distract myself with the usual tasks. But the fear persisted, gnawing at me whenever I picked up a tray. Later that night, while walking through the empty corridors, I heard voices. I followed the sound, finding a dimly lit room where a group of doctors and nurses were speaking in low voices. They had their backs to me, and I hid behind a slightly open door, listening. The words I heard chilled me to the bone. They were talking about me. They discussed how he had chosen the next victim and that I was being prepared. One of the doctors mentioned that the patient who bit me was an indicator, someone being used to test who was ready for the process. My heart raced. They were planning something for me, and it didn't seem good. Before I could leave, a dark shadow passed by the door crack, and I felt a cold presence behind me. I didn't need to look to know it was the patient, the man who had no reflection. His breathing was heavy, and he whispered my name, as if he knew me intimately. Fear took over, and all I could do was run. I ran through the corridors, feeling that presence growing closer. The hospital seemed to transform as I ran. Corridors lengthened, the lights flickered, and doors that had been open now slammed shut in front of me. It was as if the building itself was conspiring to keep me inside. Finally, I found a supply room and locked myself in, trying to control my breathing and the pounding of my heart, which felt like it was about to explode. On the other side of the door, I could hear his breathing, feel his presence, and the sound of nails scratching the wood terrified me. "I know you're in there, sweetheart," his voice whispered, almost like a sweet lover's, but laced with malice. "You don't have to be afraid. It will all be over soon." I needed to get out of there before it was too late. In a final act of desperation, I flung the door open and shoved a shelf full of glass jars, which crashed to the floor, creating a loud noise. The man, besides getting cut by the shards, seemed to shrink from the noise. I took advantage of the distraction and ran through the hospital's back exit. I didn't stop until I reached home, exhausted but alive. The next day, I resigned over the phone. I couldn't explain the reason to my superiors, just that I couldn't work there anymore. They didn't push, and I was relieved. In the following weeks, I tried to forget what happened, but I couldn't. Every time I looked at my reflection, something was different. I've slowly noticed that I'm becoming paler. Yesterday, when I tried to go out during the day, I had a heat stroke in 22 degrees heat. I fainted and was taken to the hospital, where the doctor told me I have Eagle syndrome, or as it's known in the country of origin, Orlok syndrome. He suggested I stay at St. Agnes since it's a reference on the subject. I'm afraid of what might happen if I go there. Anyway, if any of you ever work in a hospital without mirrors, run. With every creak and whisper, another story comes to life. If you're reading this, this is a warning from life. No, I'm serious. This is a warning for the people lucky enough to stumble upon this post. Be good and do the right thing and don't question it. Trust me. You do not want to know what's on the other side. Before people think I'm crazy, I'll explain my experience. It all started while I was walking home from a mundane day at school. For context, I'm in my final year of high school. I got out of the train station and was walking home before I heard a blood-curdling scream from close by. Looking around, I noticed that it was coming from an alleyway. More specifically, the alleyway that I would usually walk in, as it was the faster way home. Taking a peek, I saw a scrawny boy surrounded by two bigger dudes. While one of them was rustling through the scrawny boy's backpack, the other one was slamming his fists onto the kid's ribs. As he coughed out blood and fell to his knees, I grimaced and looked away, hoping that none of them noticed that I was looking. Fuck that, I'll just take the longer way, I thought. Subtly walking past the alleyway, I pretended to ignore the clear assault that was going on in front of me. I figured that the cops would take care of it themselves and left it at that. No way was I going to risk myself getting beat up. A few minutes later, I walked up the steep road that took me to my neighborhood. It was a slightly longer route, but at least I got out of trouble. However, no matter what, I couldn't get the kid's face out of my head. The utter pain he showed while getting punched, the desperate attempt to grabbing a hold of his bag that was getting emptied by one of the guys. The eyes that subtly conveyed the fact that he was used to this kind of life. It was all too clear in my head. As I walked to my front door, a man was standing in the middle of the road. It was a man that looked to be around 60 years old, wearing disheveled clothes. He didn't have any shoes, his nails looking sharper than toothpicks. His white beard reached down to his chest. His clothes looked like they haven't been washed in years, his teeth crooked and brown-stained. As I walked to the front door, the man maintained eye contact, his face remaining deadpan. Can I help you?" I asked. "Oh, what have you done, boy?" asked the man, shifting from a deadpan stare to a panic. "I'm sorry," I replied, reaching for the house key in my pocket and moving away in discomfort. The man, distressed, ran over to me and grabbed my shoulders. He was breathless. His eyes were filled with fear, shaking. "What have you done, boy?" He shouted even louder, now grabbing my shoulders even harder and shaking me, as if he was trying to wake me up. "What the hell?" I shouted. As I pushed him away, I gasped at a sudden force of pressure thrusting against my chest. My vision became blurry, a ringing noise piercing into my brain. It felt as if I was becoming less and less in touch with reality. "Boy, are you okay?" I could hear the man screaming, although muffled. He tried shaking me awake, but it was useless. As the world began spinning and my vision became progressively blurrier, I jolted myself awake in a place I didn't recognize. It was dark, quiet, empty. However, it didn't feel like I was anywhere. No surfaces to touch or lay down on, no light to see, no sounds to hear, no body to feel like I'm inside of. Not even a place to stand up on. Just my conscience. Suddenly, I felt a jolting pain surging across my body, a sense of pressure overwhelming my entire being. I tried to push myself away from this sensation, but it was useless. I was trapped. I then heard screams overlapping each other, cries for help, and shouts of suffering screeching throughout my surroundings. Even though no one was around me, it felt like there were millions of people. It was a sensation where my heart felt like it was about to explode out of me, but without the feeling of having a heart. The feeling of my skull being crushed by thousands of pounds, but without the feeling of having a head. The screeching of loud cries for help piercing through my ears, but without the feeling of having ears. I was empty, but in pain, like if my body was being torn apart, even though I physically couldn't feel my presence existing. Powerful, disgusting stenches filled my sense of smell. I wanted to gag, but couldn't. I wanted to vomit, but physically didn't feel like I had a body to do that. Even though I tried shouting, no words came out of me, as if I was perpetually having my existence being torn apart and slammed back together over and over again. It was loud, brutal, but also empty. Everything was felt, but I couldn't do anything about it. As the pain got progressively worse, I suddenly saw the first shed of light from a distance. As it rapidly lit my surroundings, I opened my eyes and shot a frightening scream that echoed around me. Looking around, shaking in fear, my body feeling numb, I realized that I was in my room. Every hair in my body was standing on end. My skin was completely wrinkled, as if the stress was too much for my body to handle. Running towards the mirror, my hair was completely white. My eyes were widened, lips thinned and shaking. My body was thinner, almost skeleton-like. Felt trapped. I was still, but shaking uncontrollably. Terrified, but numb. It was a feeling that I do not want to and cannot describe. Turning around, I saw a note that was left on my bed. "Be good and do the right thing. Don't question it." It wrote, "I don't know what I just experienced or what the meaning of it was, but I do not wish upon my worst enemy. I'm scared of going out, scared of looking at or speaking to anyone. I'm worried that I will go back to that place. A place of nothing but perpetual pain." Who was that man? Why did I suddenly appear in a dark place? And why do I feel like it's about to happen again? I don't want to go back. Please, anything but that. I don't know what to do, and I need help. But one thing's for sure. Be good and do the right thing. Don't question it. Trust me, you do not want to see what's on the other side. As the shadows shift, our next tale emerges from the darkness. Get up and take the knife. 100 years of supernatural family legends. Story number 2. 1944. Tajikistan, USSR. Only 1 year remained until the end of World War II. In the village where my great-grandfather lived, 70% of the men were at the front. My great-grandfather served from 1941 to 1943 and returned to the village after being wounded. He was 34 at that time. Many families were left without men, and women became the heads of households, working tirelessly to provide for their children. The children often went unsupervised, sometimes falling asleep alone at home or with their grandmothers. Great-grandfather worked to support a family of 13. His parents, his wife, 5 children, 2 unmarried sisters, and a neighbor woman with 2 children whose husband was also at the front. Previously, the neighbor had lived with an elderly man, her father-in-law, but he passed away at the age of 95 at the end of August. In early September, the body of an 8-year-old girl was found next to a garbage dump. Deep bite marks resembling animal bite marks were found on her body. Parts of the girl's arms and stomach were bitten off. Residents were horrified and assumed that this was the work of a predator, a wolf or a rabid dog. A week later, another body with bite marks was found, a 5-year-old boy. The whole village was shocked. People began to get dogs for protection. Women left their children with neighbors when they went to work, and boys 10 to 12 years old armed themselves with knives and sharpened sticks to find dangerous animals. One evening, one of the boys heard the cries of sheep coming from a neighboring house. Going inside, he saw a wolf biting the throat of a ram. The boy fought with the wolf and killed it, but he sustained serious injuries in the process. Unfortunately, he died a week later in the rural hospital from his wounds. The villagers mourned the boy and settled down, believing that the danger had passed. One Thursday, my great-grandfather came home early due to a high fever and went to bed. At that time, many people were working in factories, mills, and fields until late at night. My great-grandfather was shivering, so my great-grandmother, his wife, gave him some herbal tincture and tucked him into bed. He felt a bit better and fell asleep. He woke up feeling a heavy weight on his stomach. Opening his eyes, he saw an old man in white clothing with a long beard sitting on his stomach. The old man's eyes were hidden. My great-grandfather began to gasp, trying to push him away, but he couldn't move. "Take the knife," said the old man. "Take the knife, save my granddaughter. Get up and take the knee," the old man shouted, and my great-grandfather suddenly jumped out of bed. He realized that no one was around. He lifted his shirt and saw redness on his abdomen where the old man had been sitting, and it took him a moment to understand who it was. He grabbed his large army knife and headed toward the neighbor's house. As he approached her gate, he saw a short figure emerging from the house into the darkness. Getting closer, my great-grandfather noticed that the figure was carrying a small girl from the neighbor. The figure was cradling her and moving away. The girl was deeply asleep. Still not fully recovered from the fever and sleep, my great-grandfather was slow to understand what was happening. In a daze, with the knife in hand, he slowly followed the mysterious figure. The barking of dogs from neighboring houses could be heard, but no one came out to see what was happening. The stranger carried the girl farther from the houses, toward a small garden, and entered its shadow. My great-grandfather cautiously followed him. Entering the garden, my great-grandfather saw the stranger crouched down, holding the girl with her dress lifted and her mouth covered by his hand. The man bared his teeth and leaned in, preparing to bite her stomach. My great-grandfather reacted immediately. He threw the knife at the stranger, and the man cried out in pain as the knife struck his left shoulder blade. The girl woke up and screamed in terror, seeing the dark silhouette above her. My great-grandfather ran up, pulled the knife out of the stranger's back, and, after punching the man in the face, threw him to the ground. The stranger writhed in pain on the ground. My great-grandfather picked up the girl, holding her tightly and, grabbing the stranger by the collar with his right hand while holding the girl with his left, dragged him out of the garden toward the lit street. The barking of dogs echoed throughout the village, drawing the attention of the residents. Some came out to see what was happening and saw my great-grandfather carrying the girl and dragging someone. Approaching the crowd, he threw the stranger to the ground. Everyone was shocked by the sight. The stranger turned out to be a frail old man in worn clothing with long nails, almost a third of the length of his index finger. He had a dirty, long beard and a face wrinkled like a raisin. His eyes were round and red, resembling those of a rabid dog. The old man was writhing in pain, and his open mouth revealed his teeth, calcified and pointed. My great-grandfather recounted everything that had happened, and in their anger, the townspeople began to beat the stranger. Men, women, and even children struck him with their hands, kicked him, and some beat him with sticks and shovels. The crowd grew larger. Everyone joined in the beating. By the time they finished, the stranger's face was unrecognizable. He was covered in blood, a smashed face and an eye hanging out of its socket, muttering something in an unintelligible language. Despite his injuries, he tried to get up, mumbling in a language no one understood, until the final blow from the back of a shovel struck his temple, and he fell to the ground. Unfortunately, what happened next and who the old man was, my great-grandfather did not tell to my father, from whom I heard this story. However, from one of the village neighbors, I later learned that the old man was from a neighboring village and was very ancient. Rumor had it that he was 127 years old. The whispers of the past fade, but the terror lingers. Listen closely as we dive into another haunting story. The blood moon is dangerous. Do not be fooled. I hope whoever reads this can take my story and avoid making the mistakes I did. Please don't fall for the trap I did. The attic was suffocating, thick with dust and the weight of forgotten memories. The smell of mildew clung to the air, making it hard to breathe. But I pushed through, determined to find something, anything, that could distract me from the dull ache of my existence. That's when I found it, buried beneath a pile of old blankets in a chest that should have been empty. The book. It was heavy in my hands, the leather cover cool and cracked, as if it had been left in the cold for far too long. My fingers traced the strange symbols etched into the surface, each one sending a shiver down my spine. I should have put it back. I should have walked away. But something in the pit of my stomach, something dark and hungry, urged me to open it. The pages were brittle, almost fragile, but the text inside was anything but. The words, if they could even be called that, shifted and twisted like they were alive, teasing me with their secrets. The illustrations were worse. Horrors sketched in such detail that I could almost hear the screams of the tortured souls they depicted. My skin prickled with a sense of dread, but I couldn't stop myself. I was drawn in, pulled deeper into the book's twisted promise of power. And then I saw it, a ritual, ancient and forbidden, be performed under the light of the blood moon. The promise was simple. Power beyond imagination, the kind of power that could change everything. My heart pounded in my chest as I read the instructions over and over, each time feeling that dark hunger inside me grow stronger. The night of the blood moon was only days away, and as the date approached, I found myself unable to think of anything else. My dreams were the worst. Every night I found myself standing in a forest clearing under that blood-red moon, surrounded by shadows that whispered my name in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers would crawl under my skin, cold and slithering, leaving me paralyzed with fear. Each time I woke up, I could still hear them, echoing in the back of my mind, urging me on. The house had changed too. It was subtle at first, objects moving ever so slightly from where I left them, lights flickering even when the power was fine. But soon, the sounds started. Footsteps in the corridors, creaking floors where no one was walking. The air grew thick with a presence I couldn't see but could feel pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. I should have left then, but I didn't. I convinced myself that I was being ridiculous, that the book was just a distraction, that the strange occurrences were all in my head. I needed this. I needed something to change, and the blood moon ritual was my chance, my destiny. The night of the blood moon arrived, the sky dark and ominous, the moon hanging low and red like a gaping wound in the heavens. I could taste the metallic tang of fear on my tongue as I gathered the items for the ritual: the mirror, the candles, the knife, and the locket my mother had given me before she died. My hands trembled as I drove out to the secluded clearing, miles away from civilization, where the trees seemed to lean in, their twisted branches reaching for me like skeletal fingers. Clearing was deathly silent, the usual sounds of the night absent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I set up the ritual, my every movement deliberate, my heart racing in my chest. The candles flickered in the still air, casting long, wavering shadows across the ground. The mirror, positioned to catch the light of the blood moon, began to glow with an unnatural, pulsating light that seemed to draw me in. The incantation rolled off my tongue, the words foreign and sharp, scraping against the inside of my mouth as I spoke them. The wind picked up, a low howl that seemed to come from all directions at once, carrying with it the stench of decay. I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet, and the air around me thickened, as if the world itself was reacting to the ritual. When I reached the final step, I hesitated. The knife was cold and heavy in my hand, sharp edge gleaming in the light of the blood moon. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed the blade to my palm, the skin giving way with a sickening ease. Pain was sharp, hot, and I watched, almost mesmerized, as my blood dripped onto the mirror's surface. The moment the first drop touched the glass, the light in the mirror flared, blinding me. The world around me seemed to twist and warp, the trees bending at impossible angles, the ground beneath me rolling like waves in a storm. The air was filled with a deafening hum, a low guttural sound that rattled my bones and made my teeth ache. And then the mirror shattered, the shards flying outwards like daggers, cutting into my skin. I fell to the ground, my hands grasping at the cold earth as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My body ached, my mind reeling, but amidst the chaos, I felt it, a surge of power, dark and intoxicating, coursing through my veins. I struggled to my feet, expecting to feel triumphant, but instead all I felt was cold, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into my very soul. And then I saw it, a figure, tall and cloaked in shadow, emerging from the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as it drew closer, its form flickering like a dying flame. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning with a malevolent intensity. "You have called me," whispered, its voice a rasping echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "And now you are mine." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to speak, to scream, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by the overwhelming terror that gripped me. The entity stepped closer, its presence suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't bear. I didn't mean to. I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. It laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Cold and cruel. You sought power, and you found it. Power always comes with a price." The air around me grew colder, the darkness closing in, wrapping around me like a shroud. I could feel it seeping into my mind, twisting my thoughts, warping my perceptions. The ground beneath me seemed to fall away, leaving me suspended in a void. The world around me nothing but shadows and whispers. Images flashed before my eyes, visions of those who had come before me, those who had performed the ritual and suffered the consequences. I saw their twisted faces, their eyes hollow and empty, their bodies contorted in agony as the entity consumed them, piece by piece. I could feel their pain, their despair, their regret, as if it were my own. "No," I whispered, shaking my head, trying to banish the visions. "No, this can't be happening." But it was. The entity loomed over me, its form growing darker, more solid, as if feeding off my fear. I could feel it wrapping around me, its tendrils creeping into my mind, my soul, taking hold of everything that I was. The locket. My hand tightened around the locket, the only thing I had left of my mother, the last piece of my humanity. In that moment, I realized what I had to do. With a cry of desperation, I hurled the locket into the shattered remains of the mirror. The instant it touched the glass, a blinding light erupted from the ground, burning away the darkness. The entity screamed, a sound of pure agony, as its form began to unravel, torn apart by the light. The pain was unbearable, searing through me like fire, as if I were being ripped apart from the inside out. But I held on, clinging to the locket, to the memories of my mother, to the last vestiges of who I was. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, the clearing was bathed in the soft light of dawn, blood moon gone, replaced by the pale blue of the morning sky. The air was cool, fresh, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness of the night before. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the sky, my mind a haze of pain and confusion. The book lay beside me, its pages blank, as if the ritual had never existed, but I knew better. I could feel the void left by the entity, a hollow place in my soul where it had once been. The locket was gone, along with the power I had sought. In its place was only the memory of what I had done, of what I had almost become. I left the clearing that morning, the estate behind me, determined never to return. But I could still hear them, the whispers of the shadows, the cries of those who had come before me, echoing in my mind, constant reminder of the darkness I had unleashed. Years later, I heard rumors of the book resurfacing, found by another poor soul drawn in by its promises. I tried to warn them, but the darkness had taken root in my mind, warping my words, twisting them into lies. No one believed me. And now, every night, I lie awake, haunted by the memories of that night, by the shadows that still linger at the edges of my vision, waiting. Every blood moon, I feel the pull, the dark, seductive call of the ritual, reminding me that once you've tasted the darkness, it never truly lets you go. It waits, and one day will come for me again. The night is far from over, and the next horror awaits in the shadows. Run into the corn. I'll always be thankful for the sprawling Kansas cornfields for saving my life. Without it, who knows what would have happened to me? I don't like to dwell on it. This story happened about 9 years ago, back when I was still a stupid kid. My parents and siblings had left for back-to-school shopping, driving all the way down Wichita. 45-minute ride there and back did not interest me, so I begged to be allowed to stay home. Mom, I think I'm old enough to decide for myself if I want to go. My cocky 14-year-old self whined. Fine, but you're not getting any clothes. You have my number if you need it. We'll probably get dinner there, so don't wait up, she called while wrangling my two most quarrelsome brothers into the car. Sweet, thanks. I'd never been completely alone before. I mean, Burns was pretty rural, but growing up with 5 siblings meant I never got to enjoy the privacy that's supposed to come with country life. Hell, the concept was so foreign to me that I spent the first 20 minutes trying to decide what to do. Suddenly, my stomach growled. There was a gas station about 10 miles down the road, far too long to walk, but not too far to drive. My parents only had one car, but they'd spent last year saving up for a golf cart, with the idea that it would let us access the distant parts of our property easier. But more often than not, we used it to drive and get snacks. So, in a move that I'm sure Kevin from Home Alone would have loved, I took the cart. I loved the way it sprung to life under my touch. I loved the silence of the electric engine, the smoothness of the ride. I loved the grip of the wheel beneath my finger pad. I was so distracted by anticipation that I didn't realize that someone had left the golf cart with about a third of its battery left. Dumb kid, I know. I began driving up our dirt road. Before me stretched the gray sky, expansive and all-consuming. On clear nights, we could see every star in the sky. Even though I hated living in the middle of nowhere, I did secretly appreciate the beauty surrounding me. Glistening cornfields, air that was easy to breathe, the splashes of color from wildflowers. I turned onto the main road, one cracked and filled with potholes. For as far as I could see in either direction, there were no cars. I cranked up the speed to an adventurous 15 miles an hour. I was determined to have fun, and with any luck, be back home before sunset. The gas station was a straight shot from here. I could have driven to it with my eyes closed. In the distance behind me, a black hazy dot slowly appeared. Another car. It wasn't crazy to see the occasional car, but it still made me uneasy. Most drivers were dicks. I just put my head down and drove. Behind me, the dot grew larger. After about 5 miles, the cart began to shut down. No, 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 pleaded to the air. This cannot be happening. I pulled over to the side of the road, struggling to think. I was 5 miles away from home. There was no way I could walk there and back, especially before dark. The sun would start setting soon. Back then, phones were not something a teen just carried around, at least not middle-class teens. I also hadn't brought any form of protection. And the black dot, a rusted-up van, was still heading towards me, quickly making up the space between us. It felt like throwing up. But then, when the vehicle was about 100 feet away, it began to slow down. 40 miles, 30, 20, 10, until it was right upon me. Pulled over right in front of my dead cart. A man with a scraggly white beard opened the passenger door. "Hello, little lady. Stranded here, are we?" His voice was raspy. Like my father, he was a smoker. I was certain. He took another step toward me. "Hello. No, I'm just waiting for a friend," I blurted out, aware that the lie was stupid even before I'd said it. "Here," he responded, "is not the safest place to do that. How about I take you down the road? There's a gas station there. Your friend will find you." He continued walking towards me. "I'm not sure you have room in the car. You weren't the one driving, and you know what they say, two's a company, three's a crowd." I took a step backward. At this, he let out a guttural laugh and called to the man still in the car. "Gustav, get out here." A man slightly rounder and taller than the one in front of me stepped out. He was as old as his colleague. In his hand, the bottom of a switchblade could be seen. I freaked out. I was caught like a rat in a maze. I was miles away from civilization, and my rescuers were more like assassins. Above me, the sky dimmed. Behind and in front of me, the empty road stretched on. They would catch me in an instant. To my side was a field full of fat, dent corn, the kind you feed to livestock. In a few weeks, it would be harvested, leaving behind a shockingly empty field. Now, in just a few feet, I could hide myself. "Come here, you bitch," the one with the knife screamed as he lunged toward me. I dashed to the side and into the field of corn. The stalks slapped my face. I moved in random directions, to the left, to the right, closer to what I thought was the road, closer to the center. From behind me, I could hear them brushing past stalks and cursing. Sometimes their rustling grew louder, sometimes softer. I tried to run as fast and as quietly as I could, praying they'd give up. In my rush, I tripped over a stalk, skinning my leg in the process. Blood began to fill up the wound and drip over my ankles. I whimpered, intent on staying silent. They moved wildly and at random. Sometimes they would split up and I'd have to avoid two rustling paths. Then, they would come back together again, using their mutual malice as fuel. "You cunt. I'm gonna kill you," first guy said, mere feet away, unable to see past the layers of corn. If he had continued walking in my direction for a few more feet, I would have certainly died, the knife tearing up muscle and tendon over and over. I would have been left to be discovered days later by whoever's land I had trampled on. I thought of my parents, who would be sick with grief, and of my younger siblings who would cry at night without me to comfort them. And I thought of the long walk home, under the veil of night. And despite my attempts to stay calm, tears came flowing out. I sobbed for what felt like hours on the dirty ground. And when there were no more tears to be squeezed out, I listened for any sign of my attackers. There was none. There was no noise, except for crickets, and nothing to see except the small sliver of sky not blocked out by corn. It took me a long time to find the road in the dark. I started in a random direction and got lucky. From what I could see in the gloom of late evening, there was no van. There was also no golf cart. I suppose it was taken as a form of collateral damage. I walked home on the edge of the road, just in case another sinister black dot would appear. My clothes were ruined. For once, I didn't care. My skin stung and burned after pushing through so much vegetation. I could see the moon through gaps in the clouds as it rose higher in the sky. In all, it must have been nearly midnight when the first cop car showed up. After that, it was a blur of questions, tears, and the scent of coffee that clung to the Burns police team. My mother held me in her arms, and my father assured me that they weren't mad at me. They had called the police when they'd arrived at an empty house about half an hour before I was found. My parents apologized for being back so late, for letting me out in the first place. Everything they said melted together in my mind to create a feeling rather than any solid memory. Unsurprisingly, I wasn't the best or most eloquent victim in the world. Yet if anyone thought my story was false or exaggerated, they didn't think so after another girl disappeared a week later. She too had been left alone on a rural road near dusk. I cried when I hear that, and wondered why I had survived while she hadn't. I know on a technical level that it's not my fault, but some part of me will always feel like I should have been the last victim, that I could have done more. Sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment on a cloudy evening, I think back to Kansas. I think back to that girl, someone who was just a few years older than me, and I wish so badly that I could tell her to run into the corn without looking back. As one nightmare ends, another begins. Let's descend further into the darkness. Strand Street. When I was 8 years old, my family moved away from our busy home in the city to a small, sleepy town in the countryside. My dad had gotten a new job, you see, at the nuclear power plant. The plant loomed over the town, its chimneys coughing out thick smoke onto the houses. Our homes almost seemed like an afterthought, protruding from the side of the plant like a sudden growth when its creators realized too late that their workers would need somewhere to live. We lived on Strand Street, to the east of Building A. Although it was long ago now, I still remember the day we moved very clearly. As soon as we came into view of the towers, the air seemed to feel heavy. It was as if a damp, thick blanket had been pulled up over me, pressing down on my shoulders. When I took a labored breath, my mouth filled with an odd chemical taste. I rolled up my window. The sun was only just beginning to set. We'd been rushing around all day trying to cram the last of our things into the car, and yet the town was deserted. I pressed my face against the glass to try and peer into the windows of houses as we drove past, but it didn't seem like anyone was home at all. Each window pane was fully covered from the inside, not allowing even a speck of light to poke through. "I'm sure there'll be lots of other children in our street, Charlie," said my mom, seeming to read my mind. She turned around, squeezing my hand. I tried to smile. "That's our house right there," chimed Dad, pointing to a small brick house at the end of the terrace. As he tried his best to park on the narrow road, I noticed a couple walking very quickly past us, carrying gray shopping bags. They glanced behind them every now and then, as if they were being followed by something only they could see. They finally stopped at a house just a few doors down from ours, and the woman let out a breath she'd been holding. She then began to point towards us and whisper something to the man, who was already staring worriedly at my parents as they unpacked the car. I hopped out and stood close to my dad, who was enthusiastically shaking the man's hand and introducing us. My dad was the type of person who could quickly become friends with anyone he met, whether they wanted to or not. The man, Mr. Grieg, looked a little uncomfortable and began glancing over his shoulder again. Mrs. Grieg wrung her hands together and began to talk to my parents when she was suddenly interrupted by a knock on their window. Inside, a boy about my age was poking his head through the thick curtains as if he was searching for something. He looked down at me and broke into a wide grin, showing off a missing front tooth. As quickly as he appeared, the window was now empty, and we heard thundering footsteps from inside the house. Mrs. Grieg turned on her heel and almost ran towards the house in an attempt to herd the boy back in. He came flying down the street nevertheless, almost bowling me over. "I'm Toby," he said, barely waiting for me to introduce myself before asking about the book in my hand and talking a mile a minute about how he had just started reading that series too, and what was my favorite character, and had I got to the really scary bit. The Griegs stood on looking nervous, and my mom gently shooed Toby and I indoors to go and find my new room. As I followed Toby and listened to his excited chatter echoing around our empty house, I looked back to see the Griegs talking in hushed tones to my parent. The smile had worn off my dad's face, and him and my mom now had the same look of fear I had just seen on Toby's parent. My mom had told me weeks before, when my dad had gotten his job, that the move would take some getting used to. Some things were easier than others. I loved having my own room. There was so much more space to play than in our little flat. Even the new junior school didn't seem so scary now that I would have Toby by my side in September. But some things took a little longer to take in. Toby and I could spend hours happily playing in the road, kicking round an old football, or running about being pirates. But each day when the sun began to set, our mothers would appear on the doorstep and hurriedly call us inside. My mom wasn't quite on the same level as Toby's yet. Mrs. Grieg seemed to permanently hover behind her door, just waiting for an alarm to go off in her head so she could call him in. Toby, on the other hand, wasn't fazed at all about the curfew. When he heard his mom call, he would roll his eyes before smiling at me and jumping up from the patch of pavement serving as our ship and jogging off to his house. For me and my mom, however, the routine felt strange. My mom had always been caring to me, of course, had never seemed half as worried when we lived in the city. I could spend all day in the park across the road reading my book on the swings, only coming in for dinner once it had already gone dark. But now she would look almost scared as she waited for me to walk the short distance to our house, the frown only easing once I was inside with the door shut. My dad would return home a little while later, walking alongside Mr. Grieg after they finished their workday. Dad slid a bolt on the door when he came in. We'd close all the curtains and then sit and eat our dinner, accompanied by the ever-present humming of the plant. A few weeks later, I was almost used to our strange new routine. Something which did still get to me, however, was the noise. Even though I was used to the bustle of the city with all the traffic and people, there was something different about the noise of the plant. It wasn't even a constant humming. On the days when the acrid smoke was at its thickest, it was a grinding, groaning, booming screech that made the ground shake slightly. I mentioned this to Toby, who held his hand up to his ear and said, "Oh yeah," as if he was hearing it for the first time. "I guess you get used to it after a while. We've been here a year now. Maybe if you're here a year, you won't hear it either," he reassured me. "I don't know how you couldn't hear it. It's everywhere, even in my house," I lamented. Toby thought for a while, and then spoke again in an uncharacteristically quiet voice. "Well, there is somewhere where you can't hear it, but it's quite far away," he added hurriedly, already seeing the smile on my face. So far, I hadn't ventured further than a couple streets away. I felt cooped up and just wanted to explore. "Still very bright though, isn't it?" I asked him, looking up at the sky. Toby looked at his dinosaur watch, up to the sky and to my hopeful face in quick succession. "I'm sure we've got time," he decided. "Let's go." Toby led the way, his trainers thudding down the pavement. "Wait a minute," I called, the thick air burning my lungs as I struggled to keep up. Toby whipped around, seeming concerned about both my increasingly red face and the seconds ticking away on his watch. We compromised with a brisk walk, trying to ignore the streetlights flickering on one by one. Eventually, the pavement faded into a worn-down path, grass and dandelions creeping up out of every crack. The air began to feel still and cool. Felt as though the plant was loosening its grip on me. I'd forgotten what it was like to breathe so easily. "There," said Toby, his face flush with pride. We'd come into a clearing, surrounded by trees and covered in a lush blanket of grass. Wildflowers were dotted about, pastel shades of purple, blue, and pink amidst the sea of green. The last few rays of sunlight shimmered on a bubbling stream, over which stood a quaint brick bridge. I couldn't believe the starkness of this wonderful place to Strand Street. I'd stepped out of a black and white picture and into dazzling technicolor. But the best part of all was the quiet. As Toby had promised, all that could be heard in the clearing was the soft running of the stream and the breeze blowing in the trees. "See, I told you, Charlie," he said, his face lit up with excitement. "It's nice here, isn't it? I could have stayed there forever." We picked flowers, felt the soft grass on our toes, chucked poo sticks over the side of the bridge, and excitedly watched them sail down the stream. I felt a lightness in my chest and a sense of freedom I'd not felt since we left the city. We climbed trees, looked for fish in the brook, and watched the sun disappear down past the horizon. The sunset, time, rules. It had suddenly gotten very, very dark. Although the rules had become part of our DNA, it was difficult to grapple with the new and pestering longing to stay in the clearing for even 5 minutes more. "Our parents will be cross," said Toby, still looking wistfully towards the bridge. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he turned back towards me. "We'll come another day." I dropped my flowers and began ambling after Toby, back towards the gray. But as we headed back, things seemed different to how they had before. In the dark, the tree branches reached out over us like bony fingers, blotting out the last of the light. The plant's groaning started up again, snatching away the last comforting sounds of the clearing. Then there was a new sound, a rustling behind us, following us. Toby didn't say anything, but he took my little hand into his and we walked just a half a step faster. The rustling came again, this time closer. "Let's run," Toby whispered, his voice tight with fear. As we sped up, the rustling did too. It was louder, more frantic, like a creature on the hunt. Right as the street lamps came into view, we heard it. A loud, screeching, painful sound. The thing made a screaming howl, deep and primal, that almost knocked us off our feet. This was followed by several sharp, unnatural clicks. Whatever it was big. I didn't realize I had tripped until I smacked down hard on the pavement, scraping my knees raw and narrowly avoiding taking Toby down with me. He was too panicked to speak, desperately pulling me up. It wasn't working. I was stuck in something black. It was like a thick puddle of tar, but it was moving, gliding towards us at an unnatural speed. The noises came from somewhere deep within it, shooting out of a gaping hole in its core. Two spindly arms began to reach from the creature. The clicks and grunts were in my ear now, and the ooze was burning my feet as I tried to wiggle them free. It had just reached my knees when Toby finally gave a strong heave, and then we were back on our feet. We ran and ran and ran. Things became a blur. I remember nearly falling over the threshold in my desperate attempt to get inside. My parents slammed the door behind us, locking and bolting it, and being shoved to the ground by the thing throwing itself against the door. It wasn't finished with us yet. Toby's mum ushered us away as my parents pushed back against it. I had been in such a rush to get inside, to get away from that thing, that I hadn't noticed what it had done to my legs. The skin on my shins had melted, sloughing off to reveal red-hot, angry patches of flesh that had soaked my shoes in blood. Toby looked down at them and started to cry. He hadn't let go of my hand. We did separate finally when Mrs. Grieg began to clean the wounds, and Toby came over all faint and needed to lay down. Mrs. Grieg picked fibers out of my raw flesh where my socks had melted into my skin. I tried my best to look away, but then my focus would drift to the insistent banging on the door, and I wasn't sure which was worse. I turned my attention to Mrs. Grieg instead, who was nousing my legs with all the care and precision of a surgeon. It was as if she had done this before, like she was prepared for this. Once the banging had stopped and the thing seemed to have retreated, Mrs. Grieg needed to treat another casualty, my mum. She'd been leaning against the door when the same acid that got my legs had suddenly burst through the letterbox, leaving a big, searing rectangle on her shoulder. Later, Mrs. Grieg pulled Toby aside and told him that his dad was missing. She explained that when he and my dad came home and found our terrified mothers unable to find us, Mr. Grieg went out to search. He hadn't come back. Things were strange afterwards. My dad still smiled at me, but it never quite reached his eyes. He went to work and came home, bolting the door which had stayed shut since he left that morning. We saw the Griegs sometimes, though they mostly stayed indoors now too. I'd sometimes catch a glimpse of a tired-looking Toby rushing by, superglued to his mum's side. He wasn't the same boy I'd known before. He'd come over sometimes, following Mrs. Grieg as she helped my mum and I with our healing burns, putting on a special cream that made them sting. Toby and I could never quite look at one another, though. I knew he was feeling the same guilt I was, and it had made us wary of one another, as if we knew that at any moment either of us could make a decision again that put us right back in that situation. Nobody looked for Mr. Grieg. Life went on. People on the street went to work. Plant kept on chugging. Mum bought me long school trousers to wear. I tried not to itch my healing legs. I tried not to think about the clearing and how much I wanted to go there again. I felt guilty when I did want to. Toby and I moved through school, going through the motions. We eventually grew close again, but never talked about what had happened that night. We walked home from school together, chatting away happily, as if we were children again, laughing without a care in the world. One day, though, I wasn't thinking, and halfway through a story about a silly thing my dad had done years ago, I looked up to see Toby's downcast face. "Sorry, Toby," I said, patting his arm. "I miss him," he sighed. "I wish we could at least talk about him, but it's..." He trailed off, nodding his head towards his door, where we knew his mum was waiting. "He's still with you," I said. Toby gave a small smile before stepping inside. Over the years, things took their toll on my parents. They would wait until they thought I was asleep to argue, sometimes shouting into the early hours of the morning. I would tuck myself tight into my duvet, holding my teddy over one ear and my hand against the other, try and block out the sound, even when I had become much too old for that. Sometimes I would hear my mum shouting. On bad nights, she would drag up that night about our burns and whatever had happened to Mr. Grieg. My dad didn't usually have anything to say at all. It was a bad night tonight. It'd been 8 years since the day we were followed home. My legs had calmed from an angry red to a scarred pink. They still ached, though, as I tiptoed out onto the landing to try and hear what my mum was shouting about. "It's not worth it, Nick. It's not worth it," she screamed. It worried less about me hearing them as I got older. Maybe I should be used to it. I still held my teddy close to my chest and tried hard to hold back the tears, feeling childish. I jumped suddenly as I heard the bolt of the door slide open, and then a hard slam. I crept down the stairs, seeing my dad alone in the hallway. "Dad?" I called out. I think because the changes had been over so many years, I didn't take much notice of them. My dad had never been the biggest man, but looking at him now, I could see how much smaller he had become. He was thin and hunched over slightly, probably from the years of labor at the plant. He'd lost his hair and spent more time coughing than talking these days. He'd lost his smile long ago. He'd lost himself then, too. "She's gone," he whispered, staring past the open doorway. It took me a couple seconds to realize what that meant. My mom had gone outside at night, in the dark, where that thing would be. If my dad felt anything, it didn't show. He stood in the hall, his bony hands twitching. He didn't say anything either, when I pulled on my coat and slipped past him, out the door and into the dark. It was already ink black outside. The street lamps flickered like a flame about to extinguish. I heard a slam to my left and felt my legs buckle. "Charlie!" Toby's voice shot out. He shut his door, not bothering to be quiet. Like my dad, Mrs. Grieg seemed to have given up long ago. "Toby, it's my mom, I saw her. She went down there," Toby said, gesturing towards a winding alleyway that cut through the back of the terrace row. "Come on," he said, putting on a brave face. "I'll come with you." We walked side by side down the alley, straining to listen for any sign of my mom, and hearing only the plant's screeching groans. The earth shook beneath us, making pebbles bounce against the pavement. I breathed in the sickly chemical smell, and my heart began to pound. We checked behind us every now and then, but our parents never followed. We heard a sudden, splitting scream from what sounded like the next street over. My heart skipped a beat, and Toby reached out, gripping my hand. We continued down the alley, and I began to hear a noise that had been echoing in my nightmares for the past 8 years. Click, 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 click. Toby's grip tightened. "It's okay," I lied, not sure who I was trying to reassure. I took a tentative step forward. I felt like I was teetering along the edge of a bear pit. The clicking sounded again, this time closer. The alleyway began to close in on us. We were going head to head with the creature again, and this time we had backed ourselves into a corner. The creature was well aware of this, taking its time to make a grand entrance. Tar began to seep along the ground, hissing and bubbling. My legs began to burn just looking at it, and as I lifted my feet to run, gallons of the stuff began to surround us. I watched it dissolve a stone in its path, and a cold dread gripped my insides as I prayed we would go quickly too once it reached us. Then its arms appeared, reaching slowly from the bubbling tar, and without warning, face shot forward. It was so much worse than I remembered. A hideous screech tore from its throat, spraying tar, which landed just a hair away from Toby's head. It rose above us, a body appearing and contorting violently before slamming down again. Crawled on its front towards us, its mangled fingers digging into the concrete. The tar slipped away for a split second, and I saw a hand that could almost be human. It was all sinew and muscle, as if the black tar was its flesh. Twisted again violently, letting out another agonized howl as tar began to surround us. Just as it twisted, more tar slipped away. A human's back appeared. Plant was screeching louder than ever. Earth shook, and a deep rumbling came from inside. Heat began to radiate off of the creature, and I gagged as smoke began to fill my lungs. Toby looked over at me with a look on his face I had never seen before. Determined, resolute. He looked over at the archway behind the creature, which had widened as the tar ate up each brick it touched. He looked back at me with a faint, sad smile. "You'll be okay, Charlie," he said, softly. And then he let go of my hand. I screamed when I saw him run, bouncing off the wall and landing in a puddle of tar which sizzled against his shoes. He was out of the alleyway in seconds, leaving me alone with the creature. It looked at me, the face featureless besides a twisted open mouth. It let out a final, blood-curdling howl before spinning around, following Toby out of the alley and into the dark. The tar came unstuck from the ground and was swept behind the creature, taking a layer of concrete with it. Everything became blurry. I finally let the tears fall from my eyes. I tried to listen for any sounds of Toby, any sign that he was out there. But all that echoed through the night was the rumblings of the plant as it slowed back down into its regular rhythm. I've always found it difficult to keep up with Toby. He moves a mile a minute, and so do his thoughts. I wondered for a second how he could have known that his gamble would work. The creature would choose him instead. He must have seen what I saw too when the creature's back was exposed, a large, letterbox-shaped scar on the shoulder. The echoes of fear still linger, but something even more sinister lurks ahead. I saw the ghost of my dead ex. So my ex committed suicide over 2 years ago now. We were together very briefly, but knew one another for a long time. We went to festivals with friends. We didn't work out and it broke my heart. I check in on his sister all the time, and there was a big concert that we traveled together to see over the weekend. All our friends went too, and her brother would have if he was alive. Her and I weren't extremely close before this weekend, but I've known her for a long time and reach out as much as I can. She asked me if we wanted to carpool together because she was coming from a further away state. She was an hour away from my apartment, so I decided to take a quick nap before I started the road trip. As I dozed off in my couch, I became aware of the room around me, almost like a sleep paralysis. I felt this intense pressure weighed on my body. It wasn't scary, but it was hella intense. Surreal. Then as quickly as he came, my ex was standing above me. I jolted awake. I told his sister about this, and she told me paranormal experiences her and her other brother have had after his passing. Her entire family have had paranormal experiences. She even told me about demons she's seen, and what's crazy is I saw a demon in her brother. If you're interested in that story, there's a post I wrote a while ago on my account. Sometimes I hear him speak to me. Over the weekend, he told me he was sorry and thank you for taking care of his sister. Her and I really bonded over the weekend. She's my sister for life now. We've barely scratched the surface of terror. Brace yourself for the next chilling tale. Untitled Document, Part 1. I've always been a bit scatterbrained, especially since starting university. Between the assignments, the group projects, and endless research papers, my Google Drive is a chaotic mess. Untitled documents litter my folders like confetti after a parade. Half-started essays, random thoughts, and forgotten study notes. So, when an untitled document appeared at the top of my recent list, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual. I thought maybe I'd opened a new doc by accident during one of my late-night study sessions. It happened. But this one was different. It was a Wednesday when I first noticed it. My dorm room was in its usual state, textbooks scattered across the desk, empty cups of instant ramen piling up next to my laptop. I was exhausted, running on caffeine and stress, trying to cram in some last-minute revisions for an exam. I needed to focus, to get through just one more chapter, but the untitled document kept drawing my eye. No recent edits, no collaborators, just blank. I clicked it open, expecting to see a of random keystrokes or half-written notes, but there was nothing. Completely empty. Fresh, white page. My cursor blinked at me, almost mocking in its emptiness. Whatever, I thought. Another wasted click. I closed it and moved on. The next morning, it was back. It was early, and I was already running late for my first lecture. My laptop chimed as I booted it up, and there it was again, right at the top of my drive. Untitled. My tired brain didn't have the bandwidth to deal with it, so I deleted it and went on with my day. But it was there again the next morning. And the morning after that. I finally took notice after the 5th time it reappeared. I'd delete it, and it would come back like a bad habit. My curiosity got the better of me. I opened it again, half hoping to find something hidden. A glitch, a note, anything. But it was still blank. I sighed and stared at it, feeling this odd uneasiness settle into the pit of my stomach. I don't know why I did it, but I typed out a single word, hello? I waited. For what, I don't know. A response? Change? The page remained blank. Closed it, feeling foolish. I had better things to worry about, like not flunking out of school. A few days went by without incident, and I'd almost forgotten about it. Then one night, while I was alone in the study lounge of my dorm, the document returned. It was late, 2 or 3 a.m. I was deep in the throes of an essay crisis, my eyes burning from staring at the screen too long. My drive auto-refreshed, and there it was again, untitled document. Not this again, I muttered, but I clicked it, my irritation outweighing my reason. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples, when I noticed something off. The blank page wasn't completely blank anymore. There was a faint texture to it, almost like an impression. I adjusted my screen angle, trying to get a better look. As I tilted it, an image began to emerge, blurry, shadowy shape, embedded in the white. It was like trying to see a figure through frosted glass. I squinted harder, leaning closer, and my heart skipped a beat. It was a face, a distorted, twisted face. I jerked back, blinking rapidly. When I looked again, the document was blank. That's when the paranoia started. I became obsessed. I needed to know what was happening, whether I was losing my mind or if there was something there. Something real. My sleep schedule, already fragile, shattered entirely. I scoured forums, tech blogs, even Reddit threads about digital hauntings and cursed files. Most of it was the usual creepypasta junk, harmless stories to give people a thrill. But buried deep in one thread, I found a user who had experienced the same thing. An untitled document that kept reappearing. The post was years old. Their account was deleted. But someone had responded, suggesting it wasn't a bug but a hidden file, accessible only under specific conditions. Desperation does strange things to you. I followed their instructions. Dim the screen brightness to its lowest setting, open developer tools, and invert the display colors. It sounded ridiculous, but I had nothing to lose. The air in my dorm room felt heavy, thick with anticipation. I turned off all the lights, my only illumination the dim glow of my laptop. My breath hitched as I executed the steps, my fingers trembling over the keys. When I finally opened the document again, I nearly screamed. Words, faint and jittery, they appeared like shadows burned into the screen. You found me. My heart pounded in my ears. My mouth went dry. I stared at the words, unable to move, unable to look away. I hesitated, then typed back, "Who are you?" A long pause. I felt the temperature drop in the room, my breath coming out in misty clouds. Slowly the response appeared. "Look closer." My hands were shaking. I leaned forward, my nose nearly touching the screen. The words seemed to blur and stretch, and behind them, deeper within the white void of the document, I saw something else, a flicker of movement. Shapes shifting and twisting, like worms writhing beneath a layer of skin. I recoiled, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, the noise echoing in my silent dorm room. I slammed my laptop shut. For a long moment I just sat there, heart hammering, mind racing. The room was deathly quiet, save for my own ragged breathing. I should have stopped. Could have shut down the computer, called it a night, moved on. But I didn't. Curiosity was too strong, the pull too intense. I opened it again. This time the words were more distinct, bolder. "Don't look away." Cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt the instinctive need to obey. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, unblinking, even as they started to water and burn. And then I saw it. A new line of text appeared, slowly forming as though typed by invisible hands. "I see you." In the reflection of the darkened screen, I saw movement, a shadow. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. Just the empty room, a mess of textbooks and clothes scattered everywhere. I looked back at the screen. "Don't turn around again." The cold seeped into my bones. I felt like I was being watched, a creeping sensation that crawled over my skin. I wanted to close the document, but I couldn't. My hands were frozen on the keyboard, my fingers numb. I typed slowly, my heart racing. "What do you want?" For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing. Then the text appeared, but it wasn't like before. It was more jagged, the letters uneven, as if written by a hand that didn't quite know how to use a keyboard. "To warn you." I felt a pang of confusion mixed with dread. I typed back, "About what?" The answer came almost immediately, and this time I swear I felt the words as much as I read them. The sensation was like ice dripping down the back of my neck, about them. Suddenly, the document began to flicker, as though it were glitching. The screen started to shake, and new text flooded the page. Hundreds of lines, all in different fonts, sizes, some upside down, others typed over each other in a chaotic, frenzied mess. "Don't look away. Don't turn around. It's in the room with you. Look closer. Don't look away." The text filled every inch of the page, the letters overlapping and merging, forming incomprehensible shapes. Panic surged through me. I slammed my laptop shut and jumped up, knocking my chair over. And then the smell hit me. A rancid, putrid odor filled the room, something like rotting meat and decay. I gagged, covering my nose. My eyes watered. The shadows seemed to shift around me, darker and more oppressive. I could hear something, low, wet gurgle. like something trying to speak through a throat filled with blood. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I grabbed my laptop, my bag, and bolted out of my room, racing down the hallway of the dorm. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping in fresh, cold night air. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't go back to my room either. I spent the night in the campus library, surrounded by the dim, comforting hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft, distant chatter of other sleepless students. The next day, I tried to tell myself it was just some kind of hallucination. Trick of the mind brought on by sleep deprivation and stress. University had done a number on my sanity, and maybe my mind was finally cracking under the pressure. I spent hours in the library, my nerves on edge, every sound amplified by the silence of the early morning. I tried to work on my assignments, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the document, the shadowy shapes, the unsettling words, and the stench that had filled my room. I decided not to go back to my dorm. Not yet. I needed answers first. I logged into my Google Drive on one of the library computers, holding my breath, half expecting the untitled document to pop up again. But it wasn't there. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Whatever it was, I had seen the words, felt the cold, smelt the rot. That was real. Still, I spent the next few days living in a kind of limbo, bouncing between classes, the library, and a friend's dorm where I crashed on a too-small couch. Couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate, and I jumped at every little noise, a door creaking open, a book dropping on the floor, footsteps echoing down the hallways. I was a mess, and everyone could see it. "Are you okay?" my friend Sarah asked one day, eyeing me over her laptop. "You look rough." "Just tired," I mumbled, forcing a smile. "Been pulling all-nighters for the exams. Maybe lay off the Red Bull," she suggested, tone light, but I could see the concern in her eyes. I didn't tell her about the document. Didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? A week passed, and I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe it was just a glitch, freak, unexplainable occurrence. I even convinced myself to go back to my dorm. I pushed the door open cautiously, half expecting the stench to greet me again, but it was just normal. Clothes on the floor, books on the desk, stale air. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I decided to try and forget about it, get back to some kind of normal. Normalcy was short-lived. On a Sunday night, I was back in my room, finally allowing myself to settle back into the routine of uni life. My laptop was on, and I was listening to some music to drown out the chatter of students passing by outside. I had an essay to write, some tedious analysis on literary theories. My brain kept wandering. I glanced at my screen and froze. There it was, the untitled document, back at the top of my recent files. My stomach twisted, cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I hadn't opened it, hadn't done anything that could have triggered its return. It was just there. I stared at it for a long time, every muscle in my body tense. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But the other part, curiosity or stupidity, I'm not sure which, compelled me to click. The document opened, and my screen remained blank for a moment. But this time, the blankness wasn't quite the same. It was like the whiteness of the page was too white, too stark, like it was humming with energy. The room felt colder, the air heavier. I tilted my screen, remembering the trick that had worked before, and there it was again. The words, faint but unmistakable. You looked away. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The words seemed more ominous now, more threatening. I typed, my fingers trembling. "What do you want from me?" The response was immediate, and with every letter that appeared, I felt the room's temperature drop even further. "To show you." "Show me what?" There was a pause. Then the document glitched and flickered. I could hear a low hum emanating from my laptop, like static mixed with distant whispers. Slowly, new words began to materialize. The truth. Before I could react, the screen started to warp again, and the shadows in the white void deepened. This time, the face I saw was clearer, human, but twisted, with eyes that were too large and lips pulled back into an unnatural smile. The skin seemed to pulse, gray and mottled, almost translucent. Veins crisscrossed beneath, bulging and writhing as though filled with something thick and alive. Couldn't look away. My eyes were locked on the screen, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The face began to move closer, the mouth twitching. I could almost hear it breathing through the speakers, wet, labored breaths, like something drowning in its own saliva. I wanted to slam the laptop shut, but I couldn't move. My hands were glued to the desk, my body paralyzed by an invisible force. The face filled the screen now, the eyes staring directly into mine, unblinking, and then, slowly, the lips parted. Spoke, but not in words. It was a guttural, low growl, like the sound of bones grinding together. The noise grew louder, more distorted, and with it came a new smell, like burning hair and rancid flesh. I gagged, tears streaming down my face from the stench, and then the screen went black. For a moment, there was only silence. My own heartbeat was the only sound in the room, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I dared not move, didn't even breathe. A single line of text appeared, glowing faintly in the darkness. Look behind you. My blood ran cold. Fear was suffocating. Thick, oppressive force pressing down on me. I didn't want to turn around. Couldn't. But something deep inside compelled me to. I turned my head, just a fraction, enough to see the edge of my room. At first it seemed empty, but then I saw it. A shape in the corner, crouched low, too large to be a person, too small to be a nightmare. The darkness seemed to cling to it, like smoke swirling around something solid. It moved, just slightly, and I heard it. The wet, gurgling breaths from the screen. I whipped my head back to my laptop, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would burst. The screen flickered, and new words appeared. It's hungry. I didn't think. I just reacted. I grabbed my laptop, tearing the charger from the socket, and bolted out of my room. My footsteps pounded down the hallway, echoing in the empty corridors. I didn't stop until I was outside, my chest heaving, my breath fogging in the cold night air. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I collapsed onto a bench near the student center, hunched over, clutching my laptop like a lifeline. My hands were shaking, my heart racing. I spent the next few hours sitting there, wide-eyed and terrified, as the campus around me began to wake up. Students passed by, giving me strange looks, but I didn't care. I couldn't go back. Couldn't be alone. I wandered to the computer science lab when it opened, my legs weak and trembling. I found a grad student named Mark, who I'd seen around before. Tech wizard, always tinkering with code and breaking down firewalls. If anyone could explain this, it'd be him. I hesitated, feeling ridiculous, but desperation pushed me forward. "Hey, Mark," I said, my voice shaky. "I need help with something weird on my laptop." He gave me a skeptical look but nodded, motioning for me to follow him to his station. I opened the laptop, my fingers trembling as I logged into my Google Drive. My breath caught when I saw it. The untitled document was there again, waiting. I opened it, and Mark's face instantly changed. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, leaning in closer. The screen was flickering again, the distorted text seeping into view. His eyes widened as he saw the words appear. "You brought him." Mark stared at me, his face pale. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I breathed. "It's not." The words on the screen shifted again. "One of you will feed." Suddenly, the lights in the lab flickered, and the hum of computers died, plunging the room into darkness. The air grew thick, heavy with that same foul stench of rotting meat. I could hear Mark's breath quickening beside me. "Close it," he whispered. "Close it now." I reached for the laptop, but before I could touch it, a low, guttural sound filled the room. The same grinding, unnatural growl from my dorm. I turned my head slowly and froze. There in the corner of the lab, the shadow was back. But it wasn't just a shadow, it was a void, tear in reality itself. Light seemed to bend around it, creating an unnatural darkness that swallowed everything in its path. I could feel it pulling, tugging at the edges of my vision like it was trying to draw me in, to drag me somewhere else, somewhere I didn't want to go. Mark gasped beside me. His eyes were locked on the shape, his lips trembling. "What is that?" he managed to croak, but I couldn't answer. I didn't know, and the more I looked at it, the less sense it made. It wasn't just black, it was an absence of everything. Continuum the one. Then it shifted. It wasn't a movement in the normal sense. It was more like the shadow expanded, like a drop of ink spreading in water. Creeping cold spread across the room, and with it came a deep, resonant vibration, low and rumbling. The earth itself was groaning in protest. I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones, frequency that rattled my skull and sent a sharp, stabbing pain shooting down my spine. Mark clutched his ears, his eyes wide with terror, as blood began to seep from his nose. "Make it stop," he whispered, then screamed, his voice cracking. "Make it stop." The laptop screen glowed brighter, illuminating the dark with a sickly pale light. New words typed themselves out, one by one, jagged and shaky. "It won't stop until it feeds." I felt the words in my core, punched to the gut. Mark was shaking now, his face turning pale, his eyes darting back and forth, though searching for an escape that didn't exist. I didn't understand what was happening, but the sense of impending doom was overwhelming. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice breaking, tears streaming down my face. My question was a plea, prayer to something that would never answer. Mark didn't respond. He was transfixed by the screen, his eyes glassy. Suddenly, his hand shot out, gripping my arm with a strength that didn't match his terrified expression. His nails dug into my skin, drawing blood. I can't move." His voice barely audible over the vibrating hum. His body convulsed violently, his eyes rolling back into his head. And then he stopped breathing. His body went limp, but his hand was still clamped around my arm, his nails embedded deep into my flesh. I tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. I looked at his face. Mouth hung open, eyes wide, but there was something wrong with them. They were empty, hollow, glass marbles. And then I realized with horror he wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me. The vibration stopped, the room falling into an eerie, oppressive silence. I was too stunned to process what had just happened. The only sound was the faint buzz of electricity as the lights flickered back on. I looked at the screen again. The text had changed. "Your turn." I felt a cold sweat drip down my back. I tried to pry Mark's hand off, but his fingers felt like iron. I looked around desperately for something, anything, to break his grip. Then the light around the room seemed to warp again, and that low rumble returned, like a distant avalanche. I heard a noise, a whisper, almost inaudible, but it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Stay still." The voice was soft, almost comforting. I wasn't sure if I was hearing it or feeling it in my bones. I stopped struggling, frozen in place. And then I realized the room had changed. The lab had dissolved into a black void, and now I was standing in a different place. No longer was I surrounded by desks and computers, but in what felt like an endless library, a labyrinth of ancient bookshelves stretching up into darkness. Air was thick with dust, and the scent of mold and decay filled my nostrils. The shadows here were deeper, like ink pooling in the creases of reality. I stumbled back, finally breaking free from Mark's grip. I turned, but he wasn't there anymore. In his place stood a figure, a tall, gaunt shape that seemed to waver in and out of focus, as if it were both there and not. Its eyes were voids like holes burned into a photograph, and its mouth hung open too wide, unnaturally wide, revealing a bottomless pit of nothingness. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. I could feel something creeping up behind me, and I didn't dare turn around. The presence was overwhelming, force that pressed down on me like a weight. My breaths came in shallow gasps, my chest tightening with every second. I tried to speak, to scream, but the words stuck in my throat, and when I finally managed to choke something out, it wasn't a scream. It was a single word, weak and trembling. "Please." The figure moved closer, its limbs bending in unnatural angles, cracking and popping as it approached. With each step, the shadows seemed to thicken, and I could see something moving within them, something writhing, twisting. I realized then that the darkness wasn't just shadows, but bodies, human forms, half-seen and indistinct, writhing in silent agony, their faces contorted in expressions of eternal suffering. They were trapped in the dark, lost between worlds, each reaching out, their mouths open in silent screams, eyes locked in an endless loop of terror. And then it hit me. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't some trick or glitch. This was a door, an opening to somewhere else, somewhere we were never meant to see. The figure loomed over me now, its face inches from mine. It didn't have features, just an impression of a face, like something that had forgotten how to be human. Its mouth opened, and I saw something inside, deep within the void. Flicker of something red, wet, and hungry. I had to get out. I had to wake up or break free, but I didn't know how. The air around me grew colder, and I felt my breath freezing in my lungs. I closed my eyes, whispering to myself, "This isn't real. This isn't real." But it was. When I opened my eyes, the scene shifted again. I was back in my dorm room, my laptop on the desk. The untitled document was still open, but the text had changed. You can't escape.